25. On the way back to her quarters, the lights didn't seem as bright as they had been when Evie had left, and it was easier to take a deep breath. Whatever had happened to her inside had passed. Zax probably would have called it a panic attack, but it felt like something more. That was the problem with all this Athru DNA inside her. She had no idea if she was having a normal human reaction to anything anymore. The next symptom to pop up could indicate she was about to grow another set of legs and start spidering herself around the cargo bays. She took a deep breath before opening her door and stepping back inside. The lights in the room had been turned down enough so the stars out the window were brilliant specks of white. Esturva sat in the chair beside Evie's desk, her hands folded in her lap. "You stayed," Evie said. The question came out more like an accusation, though she hadn't meant it that way. Her mother didn't flinch. "Where else would I go?" "I don't know. I guess I thought if you were a spy, you'd try to sabotage one of our systems somewhere." "Perhaps I left and made it back before you returned," Esturva offered. "Maybe." She walked over to the window, taking in the beauty beyond. "You're a very stoic person when you want to be. It comes from years of listening to my peers speak of nothing more than the ultimate destruction of humanity and needing to hide my true feelings on the subject." Evie nodded. "When I was in that pyramid and the other took over, she knew you were my mother, and Rockron seemed surprised to learn it was you. That's because I was a trusted individual for many years." Evie kept her eyes glued to the starfield. "Is that why you left me with my father? Why you abandoned me to that fate? Your reputation?" Esturva was silent for a few moments.
"I didn't want to."
"Then why?"
"Because, had the Athru captured me and found you in my care, they would have killed you immediately, not understanding what you were."
For the first time, her voice wavered.
"What? That I was some kind of hybrid?"
"Yes," Esturva said.
"Because you look nothing like our people. I made sure of that."
"But what was the point?" Evie yelled, spinning to stare at her mother.
"I spent all of my life thinking I'm one thing, then all of a sudden discovering I'm something else. Why?"
Esturva stood, her eyes pleading.
"You have to understand. I didn't plan on falling in love with Osborn. We didn't even know it would be possible for me to become pregnant. I wasn't willing to terminate the pregnancy, though we had to make a lot of genetic modifications to make sure you were viable. While we did, I made sure your human genes would override your Athru ones, at least as far as your physical traits were concerned. I didn't know what else to do. Viable. Modifications. You make it sound as if I was a science experiment."
Tears stung at Evie's eyes, so she turned away again. She knew this would be hard, but it was difficult to imagine just how hard.
"You weren't an experiment, but you were unexpected. My entire crew worked day and night to sequence your DNA so you could survive. So many times we thought we'd lost you, and I'd begin to grieve, only for you to rally back again. It was stressful."
Evie hadn't considered her dual nature had been difficult to create. After she'd learned she was part Athru, she'd just assumed it was something that happened. After all, so many species in the Coalition mingled all the time. Though most were genetically compatible, many weren't. She'd heard of some species going to extraordinary lengths to have hybrid children, but nothing so involved as what Esturva described. They did most of their work before the pregnancy. Hormone therapies, gene therapies, special foods. All of it designed to make the parents more compatible with each other. But to have two species compatible immediately, with one not being able to bring the baby to term on their own, was unheard of. Evie sighed.
"I guess I should thank you for all your hard work to keep me alive." "No, that's not something I need thanking for. You didn't ask to be brought into this world, but I'm glad you're here."
She walked over and stood beside Evie, staring out the window as well.
If you can, tell me about Osborne. The reports I got from Marshall weren't very detailed. I'm not sure how much you knew, but he kept his distance, Evie said.
She still didn't like the fact someone had been following her most of her life, and she'd never suspected them. She was supposed to be an observant, smart person. Perhaps that was part of the reason she no longer thought she was qualified for the captain's chair. Because if she had missed Marshall all those years, what else had she missed?
He tried not to interfere in your life. I told him to always stay back and to only check in on you occasionally, to make sure you were okay. He wasn't watching all the time, if it makes you feel any better.
I just don't like the idea of being watched, she replied.
I'm sorry about that.
Evie thought she might add something else about being a concerned mother needing to check on her child, but she didn't. What Evie couldn't understand was why she didn't just talk to Osborne instead of going through all the hoops with Marshall. Wouldn't that have been simpler?
Osborne was...
Evie found it hard to put into words what she felt. She'd spent so long burying him deep in the backyard of her mind. Digging him back out again was arduous.
I didn't think fathers could be any other way until I was at least 5 or 6. I started to see other parents dote and love on their children. And I wondered what was wrong with me that he never did that.
Never? Estreva asked. There was real concern in her voice.
I think he tried sometimes. He'd buy me things. But they were usually things he liked better himself, or that he expected me to like, rather than what I actually liked. It was as if he tried to make me into a person I wasn't, and when I pushed back, he didn't want to hear it. That wasn't the man I knew, she whispered. The end was the worst, Evie said. What do you mean?
Right. Marshall wouldn't know about what happened down in Sypaxia, because it had just been her and Cass, and she'd sworn Cass to secrecy. It was nice to know he could be counted on to keep some things to himself, especially when they were this important.
Osborne died a few weeks. Well, I mean, it was 18 years ago, but to me, it's only been a few weeks. Maybe a quarter of a season. I've lost track of time. I knew he had passed, Estreva said, her voice soft. But I didn't realize you were there. I wasn't. Not when he finally died. But I was there a few days before. He'd gotten worse, much worse. And
She choked off a sob, stopping it in its place. She wouldn't shed any more tears over that bastard. Not after what he'd done to her.
Let's just say he wasn't in his right mind. He'd gone crazy. Though it was the first time he'd ever said anything about my mother. He called her Amanda Lawson, though I'm assuming that was just his brain deteriorating. She was one of the other officers on his ship. He never mentioned you.
Estreva nodded.
We had an agreement.
Evie pushed out a long breath of air.
You can rest assured knowing he honored it to his dying day. Nice to know he was good to at least one person.
Estreva didn't respond. She only continued to stare out the window beside her daughter. Internally, Evie was screaming for the woman to at least agree with her, to tell her that, no, she wasn't out of line to say Osborne had been terrible. But it seemed all she was going to get was a series of half-hearted apologies.
Typical, Evie thought. Why would I expect anything else?
Estreva cleared her throat and opened her mouth. 26. Cass slid his hands over the smooth conference room table, considering Zen had done a decent job at redesigning the layout of the room to be more efficient than it had been before. The table still ran lengthwise through the room, but one of the walls was further out, which could allow a large group of people to congregate in the event they needed more than just the senior staff or a few specialists to join them. and it opened up the room, gave them more space to breathe. He wondered what had been behind the wall originally that she'd removed to make the space. Not that it mattered. But he couldn't help himself try and decode a puzzle when his brain was otherwise on autopilot. "We're sure you want to go after this?" Hank checked his notes. "Bortos? That's our target?" "It is," Zenfor replied. She stood in her regular corner, her considerable arms crossed. "I've spoken to Bay 1, Hank said. They have a shuttle prepped and ready for you. How long until we reach the Bortos?" "That's where we may run into a problem," Isaac Ron said. He tapped the control panel in front of him, and a 3D representation of space came up in the middle of the table. The sill border was on Cass's side of the table, but he was only half paying attention. Since he'd decided he most likely wasn't coming back, some things didn't seem as important as before. "Natalia and I have been scanning the sill border, and we keep getting those trace filament trails we detected back on Sisk on the long-range scanners. I'm worried there might be an Athru blockade out there, waiting for us." "It won't matter," Zenfor said. "We should be able to run it as long as we don't smash directly into them." "Captain, what do you think?" Hank asked. Cass stared at the table some more, appreciating its smoothness, its uninterrupted and undamaged surface gleaming and clean. "Captain?" He blinked a few times. "Right. Blockade. I agree with Zan. We blow right through. As long as an Athru ship isn't in our path, we won't have to slow down, and they can't catch us." "What about the sill ships?" "Just the 3 in the area." "I suggest we go in here," Zenfor said, pointing to an empty section of sill territory. "That way, once the other 2 ships are alerted we are in their territory, we'll be on our way to the Bortos. There's a good chance it will be called as well, and will end up meeting us before we reach its current position. That should give us enough time to engage the ship, lower its defenses, and get our team on board. Tempest will then have to leave the area, swing around, and come back to collect us, assuming we stay alive that long." "Or," Cass said, "if we succeed in the negotiations, we won't even have to worry about it." Zenfor pulled her arm back and retreated to her spot without saying another word. Cass's comm beeped. "Captain?" "Go ahead, Zax." "I need you in sickbay. It's important." Cass ran his hand down his face. "Can it wait? We're in the middle of something up here." "No, sir," she said, her voice curt. "It cannot." She ended the comm. Cass stood. "Work out the rest of the details and get me a summary. I want to go over it once more before we engage. I'll be in sickbay if you need me." The heads at the table nodded, while Zenfor didn't move. Instead, her eyes stayed on him until he was out the door. What could be so important Zax needed to pull Cass away from strategizing? If someone had been hurt, she would have said so. But it sounded more important than that, if that was possible. More urgent, even. Cass stepped off the hypervator, and with new purpose in his step, strode to sickbay where the doors parted for him automatically. At the far end of the room stood Zax and Box, leaning over a screen showing what looked to be biological information. As Cass entered, Box turned to him, his eyes flashing with excitement. "You're never going to believe this." "What is it? What's wrong?" Cass asked, approaching the pair. "Total game changer. The stallions have left the stables," Box announced. "Captain, I wanted to speak with you first, because I believe this might involve ship security. Otherwise, I would have gone directly to the primary party involved. In a moment, I hope you'll see why I made this decision," Zax said. Her upper hands held a small screen, which she tapped while her lower hands wrung themselves together in a nervous sort of gesture. "Zax, you're freaking me out. Just tell me what's going on." "Here." She handed him the screen she'd been working on. "Those are Resterva's brain scans. I took them when she provided a DNA sample. I thought they looked familiar, but I couldn't understand why until I remembered something when speaking with Captain Diazol earlier." She turned to the screen on the cart sitting between her and Box. "Look at the brainwave patterns in your hand, and look at the ones on this screen," she said. Cass did. In front of him, blue, light green, and light red lines moved up and down in a regular pattern, indicating electrical activity in the brain. When he looked at the second screen between them, Cass saw a similar pattern there too. "Is it the same scan?" he asked. Zax shook her head.
"No. One is from Esturva, and the other is from Captain Diazol."
"Point of order. She prefers to be called Evie now," Box interrupted. Zax ignored him.
"But it's not her regular brain scan. It's the scan I made when she was having all those hallucinations, back when we were in orbit of Omicron Terminus, remember?"
How could Cass forget? Evie had almost killed herself and Commander Wolf on their shuttle, trying to land on an arch only she could see, but that had turned out to be real after all. "I don't understand. Are you saying their patterns are the same?"
"Almost. There are tiny variations."
She pointed to different areas on the screen, showing where slight deviations made the difference between the two.
"And these patterns don't match Evie's normal brainwave operations. It was only while she was having those hallucinations Sester helped her with. I don't know how to explain it. Perhaps it's something all Athru share, or it might just be unique to the two of them. But Esturva has some connection to when Evie was having all those problems."
Cass found he had a hard time swallowing. Does this mean Esturva caused the hallucinations that almost killed her? "That's the assumption, boss," Box said. "But we don't know how. Not unless Esturva was on the ship or near it when they began. There's no known method for transmitting something like this." His heart picked up its pace. "Is there any way this could be coincidence? Or explained by anything else?" Zax's face grew more serious.
"Every person I have ever examined has their own distinct brainwave patterns. I've never seen a duplicate like this before. If she didn't cause them, Esturva knows something she's not telling us, and it involves her daughter. This is why I wanted to come to you first. Evie might not be receptive to hearing this right now."
Now he understood why she'd called him down here. "I appreciate you bending the rules regarding patient confidentiality."
"You and I both know those rules don't always apply," Zax said. "Sometimes you just have to follow your gut. This was mine."
"Do any of the other nurses know?" Cass asked. Zax shook her head, her bottom hands coming together.
"I kept this off the sickbay record. Esturva doesn't even know I took the brain scan. But I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. She has some answering to do. I checked with the only other person I know who can keep medical records confidential." She glanced to Box.
Cass turned to leave. "I need to speak with her." "You want some backup? In case things get hairy?" Box asked. He shook his head. "Your place is here, healing. If I need help, I'll call security." Zax stepped forward to stop him.
"Don't underestimate her. If she finds out we've been going behind her back, there's no telling how she'll react. Whatever this is, whatever it means, it might be the thing that sets her against us. If I were you, I'd make sure she's back in the brig before I told her."
"Thanks, Doc. I'll take it under advisement." He pointed at the screens. "Send a copy of that to my personal files, will you?" She nodded. As soon as Cass was back in the corridor, he tapped his comm. "So? Where's Evie at the moment?" "The locators show she's in her quarters," Saul replied. "And Esturva?" "In Ms. Diazol's quarters as well, Captain. Is there a problem?" "No problem. I just needed to check. Thanks." He ended the comm. All thoughts of infiltrating Sill Space had left his mind. Before they did anything, he needed to find out what this connection meant, and if Esturva was really hiding something. But he wasn't about to drag her back down to the brig and interrogate her, or blast his way into Evie's room with a security team. They'd been down that road before, and it had only ended up in disaster. He told the others they needed to start trusting people, so that was a leap of faith he was willing to take. He had to trust Esturva wouldn't kill them for confronting her with this information. He just hoped she could see past her prejudice of him to know he wasn't a threat. Besides, if she was holding something back, Evie deserved to know too. 27.
Evelyn, there's something you need to know about me and your father.
Esterva turned away from the window, instead standing with her back to Evie at the far end of the room. She'd put a lot of distance between them, and Evie wasn't sure if that was for Esterva's own benefit or Evie's. It was obvious whatever she needed to tell her was difficult, and possibly even painful. But Evie didn't care. She just wanted answers. She wanted to understand.
We came to an agreement once we realized we couldn't stay together. The Athru were closing in. They knew something was wrong, and I decided it was best that me and the crew abandon our ship and our mission and scatter ourselves to the stars. That way we could search out new ways to defeat the Athru, or at least change their minds. But I couldn't bring a human and a newborn with me. It just wasn't possible. But I...
A chime at the door cut her off. Evie said.
Hold that thought. I'll get rid of them.
She went to the door, and it slid open to reveal Cass, his face tight with worry and anguish.
What's wrong?
He glanced between her and Esterva. I need to tell you something. And she, he pointed to Esterva, has some answering to do. Evie bit the inside of her lip as adrenaline surged through her system.
Answer for what?
She stepped aside as Cass made his way into the room. He was careful not to get too close to Esterva, like he feared she might lash out at him. Esterva's face had gone from one of peaceful resignation, perhaps with a tinge of regret and remorse, to angry and reproachful. Evie knew she blamed Cass for the war, but that couldn't be it, could it?
Yes. Answer for what?
Esterva asked. Cass stepped over to Evie's desk, and on her display he entered his own credentials, bringing up his files. This is your brain scan from when you first came on the ship, Cass said, showing a series of lines displayed on a moving grid.
You took my brain scan without my permission?
Esterva seethed. She stepped forward, but before she reached him, Cass tapped the screen again, and a different image came up. And this is your brain scan from when you were first hallucinating, he said, ignoring Esterva and staring at Evie. Esterva stopped in her tracks. Evie squinted at the two images as Cass superimposed them over each other. They were nearly identical.
What?
Was all that escaped Evie's mouth. Did this mean what she thought it did? Esterva turned to her.
Evelyn, please, listen for a moment. Did you cause my hallucinations? Are you the reason I had those crippling visions? Why I could see the Athru structures through the time bubbles when no one else could?
Esterva put her hands out.
Yes, in a way. But not how you think. Allow me to explain.
You've had 5 days to explain. Why not tell her as soon as you came on board? Or even on the planet? Cass asked. Why does it take us finding out you haven't been honest with us to force an explanation? And why should we believe it anyway?
Because before you rudely interrupted us, I was in the process of telling her, Esterva snapped. I swear you have the worst judgment of anyone I have ever met. Mother, Evie said, fed up with the bickering, what is going on?
Esterva turned back to her.
I don't know if the other Athru told you this, but something that is unique to our species is knowledge and information is passed down through our genetic code, in the same way favorable traits are passed to an animal's offspring. We developed the skill long ago to maintain the sanctity of our traditions. It isn't perfect, and it's hard to transmit specific information, but all Athru children are born knowing the basic history of the Athru and our beliefs. They are also aware of their parents and understand they are whole people.
That sounds like quite the time saver, Cass quipped. Instead of teaching your children what they need to know, you just load it up into their genes, and bam, they're ready to go. Her mouth turned into a sneer.
If you must know, it doesn't work like that. We don't choose what information is passed along. It's determined by the parents' experiences. But because most people in Athru society agree about our goals as a culture, most children understand the same basic principles when they are born.
Evie felt a tremble move through her.
Is that what happened to me? I was born with genetic knowledge? In a way, Esterva said. Remember how I said we had to keep modifying your genetic code to keep you viable? Part of that process was trying to filter out the genes that transmit this information, because I didn't want you to know anything about Athru society. I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again, and I didn't want you saddled with the burden of knowing you could never join us. I had planned to have found a way to defeat the Athru by the time you became an adult. But in the event I failed, you wouldn't know any different. And therefore, you'd never have to experience that loss. So what then? It didn't work?
The tremble had increased enough, Evie felt it in her leg. It wanted to bounce, but she willed it to be still. Esterva hesitated.
Despite all our knowledge, I couldn't find a way to completely remove the affected genes without killing you. We had to do the next best thing. Bury everything. Bury and hide it so deep in your subconscious it would never find its way out. But based on Marshall's last reports, it seems all I ended up doing was splicing off the Athru part of your personality and tuck it away so it could fester like a cancer within you.
Dagnya, Evie said. She sat down before she became lightheaded. Esterva sat as well, hugging the back of the chair.
You have to believe me. I never thought that would happen. I had no idea that was a possible side effect. We just thought you were you, and that was the end of it.
That doesn't explain these brainwave patterns, Cass said.
It does, which will become clear in a moment. Because Evelyn was a newborn, all we had to do was build a mental lock around the information contained in the genes themselves. We knew you wouldn't retain any memory of your time with me or the Athru as a baby. You were too young.
Evie leaned forward.
But you didn't just do it to me, did you?
Esterva stared at the ground a moment.
I want you to know, he and I discussed all of this at length. He knew the risks, but he agreed it was best for both you and him if I modified his memories, so he would never be tempted to reveal our existence.
Tears formed in the wells of her eyes, but she didn't blink them away or take her gaze off Esterva. Finally, the answers she'd sought for so long were within her grasp.
I modified his memories, implanted a false story about another woman, your infamous Amanda Lawson, and about how she committed suicide. I created the illusion they'd been in space for all the months they spent with us, drifting in escape pods. And I did it, knowing it would eventually kill him.
A tear fell from Evie's eye, but she didn't interrupt.
You see, human memory is a fickle thing, and messing with it can lead to disastrous consequences. I knew giving Osborne the guilt of the woman he loved committing suicide, as well as obscuring his time with us, would wear him down. Eventually, it would tear his mind apart, which is what happened. Do you know why he was assigned to Sisk?
Evie found forming words difficult, but she knew. Once he and the others had been discovered in the escape pods, they'd been taken back for debrief, and Osborne had taken a low-key job in Sisk doing research.
He'd had enough of space. He wanted a quiet place. The truth was, he was deemed too unstable to return to active duty. They gave him an easy job on a planet far from the core, so he would stay out of the way. And his newborn daughter went with him, Esterva said. He was swept under the rug, as they say. I don't believe this, Evie whispered.
She finally wiped her eyes and stood, turning her back on Estrva. She had been the one who had ruined her father's mind.
When you modified his memory, it changed his personality, didn't it? It turned him.
She didn't have to turn around to understand the implications of the silence between them. She'd known.
I don't want to make excuses. We were in a tough situation, and we knew there was a risk he would lose some aspects of his personality after the modification. Unfortunately, that turned out to be his empathy and his compassion. I don't think they were gone completely, but I believe over the years they were chipped away until only an emotionless robot remained, Evie yelled, spinning on the spot. Her eyes filled to the brim once again. All those years of mental anguish, of me asking myself why I wasn't good enough, all of it was because you had fucked with his mind. If you'd just left him alone, if you'd let him be the man you knew when you met him.
She stared at the ceiling, the tears running down the sides of her cheeks.
God, all the fights, all the nights of me slamming my door in his face, or him looking at me like he didn't even know me. She couldn't believe it. It hadn't been her at all, and it hadn't been him either. It had been this woman who screwed him up before Evie ever got to know him. Half his mind was stripped from him before. That's why he was so frail at the facility on Cypaxia, wasn't it? Why he looked 30 years older than he actually was.
She dared a glance at Cass, whose eyes seemed to shimmer themselves. Estrva's voice had grown small.
Yes, I knew it would kill him one day. Eventually, the blocks I put in his memory broke down, driving him insane.
She glanced up.
I think that's what set off your hallucinations. The mental blocks I'd built in him were somehow used to open up your own neural pathways, to give you access to all your nascent Athru information. Though I imagined it was like trying to find one's way out of a dark room with only one door. It takes a while. He attacked me, Evie said.
Cass was the only other person who knew, unless she counted Sester. But Cass had been there. He'd seen it for himself.
Attacked? Estrva asked. He pinned me down.
Evie's eyes had glazed over, thinking back.
I couldn't understand how he was so strong. And he was spouting nonsense, saying something about someone making him promise that no one was supposed to know. I thought he'd meant Amanda Lawson at the time. But he meant you, didn't he?
Estrva nodded.
And all of it for what? So he could keep your secret? So no one would know about your existence? I hope it was worth it. She turned to leave. You must understand, Estrva said, standing. If the Coalition had found out about my people back then and gone looking, it would have been a disaster. I did everything I could to keep the Coalition in the dark, because I thought I could find a way to stop my people. I thought I could turn their minds, make them understand humans weren't the enemy. But I failed. And everything I feared happened anyway.
She stared at Evie.
So yes, it was all for nothing. Everything I put your father through, everything I put you through, none of it mattered in the end. It mattered to some people, Evie said. It mattered to Marshall, and to a woman named Laura Yamashita. Because if that fucking thing had never been unleashed, she'd still be here right now. So don't tell me it didn't matter.
Her voice had gone cold, but there was a new strength in there she hadn't felt before, like a calm coming over her, focusing her mind.
Cass, get her off this ship. I never want to see her again. Evelyn,
Estrva began, but Evie put a hand up, stopping her.
Don't speak to me ever again.
She turned and left them there in her room. When Evie emerged into the corridor, she found her tears had dried and her heart had slowed. There was nothing more for her here. There was nothing more for her anywhere. 28.
I never should have told her.
Esturva slumped back down to the chair. Cass remained quiet a moment. He wasn't sure what to make of the confrontation. Had this woman really been the source of all of Evie's misery? Although that wasn't fair. Not unless Esturva had known what she had done to Osborne would eventually open Evie to being vulnerable. Though Osborne hadn't been the only one on that ship. What about the others? He finally asked.
What others?
There were 12 survivors from Osborne's ship, he said. I assume you had to modify the memories of the other 11 survivors as well. She nodded.
But none were as involved as Osborne. No one else needed to explain where a child came from out of nowhere. No one else had to live with the guilt that someone they thought they loved had committed suicide because they couldn't stand being around them or the baby. It was always going to be problematic.
It seemed like the circumstances around the story were more suspicious than they needed to be. There had to have been a simpler way. Why suicide? Why not just make the woman die in an accident? Esturva sighed.
Believe it or not, that was Osborne's idea. He said unless he believed she forcefully tore away from him, he would have questioned why he hadn't done more to save her, including sacrifice his own life. If we, by accident, left him a memory of Amanda dying in the escape pod, he would have kept her body. It had to be something so visceral he'd never want to think on it or challenge it ever again.
Cass sat on the edge of the bed. Sounds like we've both made some questionable decisions in the past. She glanced up, narrowing her eyes.
I hardly think the destruction of one life compares to the loss of trillions. Not to mention planets, stars, other...
But you said yourself, Cass interrupted, it was your responsibility to keep the Athru from even finding out about us. If you really want to go back to what started this, it was when they discovered our existence. Not when I stopped the Coalition from obtaining a weapon that could defeat an enemy we had little knowledge of. She didn't reply. Why do you hate me so much?
Because you remind me of myself, she blurted out. You want to do the right thing, but because of your naivete or stupidity, I don't know which, it often backfires, making things worse than they would have been otherwise. I was convinced if we sent the survivors of the Austin back to the Coalition, they would learn of the Athru within weeks. But if I could do my job properly, they never would have needed to know.
Cass rubbed at his temple, a headache brewing in the back of his head. What would have been the harm in giving the Coalition time to prepare, to let us know what was coming so we could build up our defenses, maybe even broker a treaty with the Sill instead of trying to steal their weapons from them? She shook her head, a sarcastic smile on her face.
Think about it. Not only would the Coalition have sent out envoys to meet the Athru and try to broker a peace with them, but they would have used it as an excuse to sanction more missions like the one you were on. The general population would have been kept in the dark, and the Coalition would have authorized more and more clandestine missions, all in the name of maintaining the species. If there's one thing I know about humans, it's that they will do anything to survive. And if that means burning a planet to the ground because the fumes will power a superweapon that keeps their enemies at bay, they'll do it. I was determined not to let your people fall back into old bad habits.
Cass gave her a dismissive wave. What are you talking about? We've never been genocidal.
You've never been pushed. You've always had the protection of the Klaxians, the Untu, the Lekmakal. You've had it easy. Never known true desperation. All of your conveniences are provided to you via the innovations of other species. All you did was bring them all together. And that's not important? Of course it is. But in the last 2,000 years, name a time when the entire Coalition was threatened with annihilation, when every planet was at risk, and you were so outmatched you didn't know what you would do to survive.
Cass ran his hand along the edge of the bed, its soft covers tickling his hand. There was the Sill incident about 100 years ago.
An incident you initiated. And that's not what I'm talking about, because the Sill didn't retaliate. But if they had, if they decided they would invade the coalition and add it to their own territories, subjugating everyone within, how do you think you would have responded?
Cass didn't know what to say.
You wouldn't have turned over like the Claxians, I can tell you that,
Estrva said. She seemed to gather her anger and reset herself.
You know her better than I do. Will she be okay?
She's as tough as they come, Cass said. I don't know many people as resilient as she is. No matter what happens, she takes the hits and keeps on coming. But this could be different. I'm not sure she's ever been cut so deep before.
I should go after her.
Cass put his arm out, stopping her. Return to your quarters. She needs a break.
You dare to order me around? I'm
on my ship, and I'm the acting captain. So unless you're going to kill me right here, get back to your quarters before I have you dragged there. I'm not above using whatever means are necessary. Her eyes flashed, and she pushed past his hand.
Will someone at least inform me my daughter is okay? I'm not used to inflicting harm on those I care about.
Give her some time. We'll see what happens. Estrva's large eyes stared at him for a moment. There was no telling what was going on behind there. But for the briefest of seconds, Cass thought he saw something he could only describe as a humanesque quality. Her eyes upturned and her mouth pulled down into a frown, and she looked like she might cry. But the move was so subtle, only someone practiced in reading expressions would have caught it. He'd never seen any other species do something like that. Up until that moment, he thought it had been confined to just his own, and he felt a strange kinship with her.
Just let me know.
She turned and left him alone in Evie's room, wondering what he'd just seen. Evie walked along the empty corridor, running her hand across the shallow metal shelf that sat up against the large windows on level 2. Beyond the reinforced polycarbonate panes were billions of stars, with unknown number of species on planets surrounding those stars. What if she could start over somewhere fresh? After all, what was left for her here? The coalition was gone. Any family she'd once had was most likely long since deceased, and she'd lost the only command she'd ever had. It wasn't as if she could transfer to another ship and start over. Not that she would anyway. She wanted to mourn the coalition, but after learning about its true nature, all its flaws and subterfuge, she wasn't even sure she was sorry it was gone. Her heart went out to all the lives lost and all those destroyed by what the Athru had done. But the actual coalition itself, with its backdoor deals and corrupt admirals, she didn't miss at all. It had become a decayed old thing that needed to die. But in its place was what? A subjugated state where only non-humans were allowed to exist? If she wasn't allowed here, then why not leave? What if she just pointed a shuttle in a random direction and took off, looking for a new place to live? More than likely, she'd run out of air, fuel, and supplies before she found anything. It wasn't like the shuttles could go as fast as Tempest. Evie leaned on the shelf with both palms, her head sinking between her arms as she let out a long breath. Well, she'd wanted answers, and she'd gotten them. Her entire upbringing had been a manufactured lie, or at least based on one. She couldn't decide if Estrva was worse for implementing the procedure or Osborn for agreeing to it, knowing the eventual consequences. Despite knowing what Estrva had done to him, her feelings for him hadn't changed, and she wasn't sure they ever would. Regardless if his mind had been fucked with or not, he had still been horrible to her through most of her life. But she mourned the life she could have had. Maybe if she'd had a loving family, she wouldn't have been so eager to get away, to find something else. Hey! Evie raised her head to see Cass standing at the far end of the corridor, half his face shrouded by the shadows created by the large windows.
I'm fine, she said, lowering her head again. You don't need to worry about me.
I wasn't worried. I just wanted to come up here for the view, he said. She smiled, but didn't let him see.
Did you throw her off the ship yet?
Yeah. I'm surprised you haven't seen her lifeless body go floating by. He walked over and stopped a few meters away. She glanced up to see him lean against the window, his back to it. She's headed back to her room. When she didn't reply, he continued. I figured if she was a spy, she's the worst one I've ever met. A spy wouldn't try to psychologically scar you for life. They'd want you to feel comfortable around them all the time.
Yeah, that is definitely not the case, Evie said. If I see her again, there's a good chance I'll shove my fist into her gray alien face.
I'll make sure the sensors are off. No one will know. She turned to him.
Did I ask for this? I mean, what did I do that makes me such a magnet for terrible things? All this time, I've been thinking my destiny was somehow connected to my heritage. That because I was part Athru, it was for a reason. That maybe all the death and destruction I've caused wasn't for nothing, and some good would come out of it. But it turns out I'm little more than a mistake that someone couldn't bring themselves to erase. So instead, they just lied to me my entire life.
He locked eyes with her. It's more than one person should have to deal with, but it's not for nothing.
Yeah? How's that? My entire history was manufactured, and I wasn't even supposed to exist. My presence has done nothing but make things worse.
That's not true. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here right now. Box and I would have died along with everyone else when the Athru invaded. Your presence has made a big difference to me. And if it weren't for your suggestions and advice, we never would have come to Sill Space in the first place and found Zenfor. As a result, the entire crew would have died at the XL Nebula. She hated to admit he was right, because on some level she liked the self-pity. It wasn't a place she went very often, but when she did, she liked to indulge. And Cass's arguments for her value were throwing her off track. Plus, the whole heritage thing is bullshit anyway, Cass said. You're your own person. It doesn't matter where you came from or what your upbringing was. When I met you, you were one of the best officers in the fleet. You did that despite everything you went through. I should know, because I went in the opposite direction. I was born into a military family and ended up being a pirate. She chuckled.
You weren't a pirate. You were a courier.
For a corrupt authoritarian dictator who cheated, lied, and killed to get her way. She shrugged.
A job's a job. Isn't that what they used to say in the Sargan Commonwealth?
He moved a little closer. Yeah. You did what you needed to survive. We were proud we didn't need the Coalition watching over our every move, making sure we were being good little boys and girls. He sighed. But honestly, I wouldn't have chosen it. I think part of the reason I came back with you was because I missed all this. I missed at least trying to do something good, rather than just accumulate wealth and power. Not that I was any good at it anyway.
Well, you're not a pirate now,
she said, pointing to the makeshift rank he'd affixed to his jacket. He shook his head. This is only temporary, until you're ready to take over again.
I'm not sure that day will ever come, Cass. I've lost the trust of the crew. Just look at the pilots down at the brig. They're just the most vocal ones. But I know a lot of them don't know if they can put their faith in me anymore. My actions had consequences.
He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Somehow I don't think that's going to stop you. I haven't seen anything that could ever do that yet.
I was just thinking, she said, patting his hand, then holding hers there. Back when you first came on board, all you wanted to do was get away. To fly off into the void. Go find something no one has ever seen before. I'm starting to see the appeal.
His hand dropped away. Are you saying you want to leave the ship?
Maybe. All of this has taken the wind out of me. I'm not sure I see the point anymore.
He was silent for a moment.
That's not where you belong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Your place is here, with us. I think if you give the crew a chance, you might find out they're not as antagonistic as they might seem. Evie knew he cared, and he might be the last one on the ship who still did. And she knew he was trying to make her feel better about this whole situation. But if she wasn't a starship captain, and she wasn't a human or an Athru, then what was she? How were you supposed to know what to do if you didn't even know who you were? She sighed, staring out at the stars flying by, wondering just how far away each of them were. 29. He wasn't making much progress, if any. Cass had come up here to try and help Evie sort all of this out, but it seemed like he was only making things worse. But she wouldn't really leave, would she? Where could she go? He didn't want to lose her, not because she had to be there, but because she was his friend. Not to mention, going off by herself probably wouldn't be very good for her psyche. He'd been lucky he'd never had to be completely alone while working for the Sargans. And as much as he complained about Box, he was secretly glad he was around all the time. It made space seem a lot less lonely. Though he could never tell Box that, as he'd never hear the end of how much Cass loved his shiny metal body. But he was pretty sure, deep down, the robot already knew. Time stretched between them, and Cass could sense Evie was about to turn away in search of an answer that didn't exist. He hated to see her in so much pain, but what could he do? What Esterva had revealed had been horrible. In fact, everything she'd said to both of them had been worse than he could have imagined. At least, he began, testing the waters, at least you asked. But she seems to have no shortage of free advice for me. Evie turned to him, and he could see her concentration had been broken. What? Considering she blames me for the entire war. You know, nothing big. Evie scoffed. You don't actually believe that, do you? She's just... what? Angry? Confused? Her eyebrows drew down. No. I don't know why she seems to have such a problem with you. But you know it doesn't matter, right? You're obviously not the cause of the war. I know, Cass said. And he did. But I can't help but think, what if she's right? What if I had never gone against Rutledge, and we'd acquired the weapon 3 seasons sooner than they did? So Maya never would have sabotaged it, probably. And the Coalition would have had a real weapon to use against their enemies. You don't know that, she replied. She stiffened, clenching her jaw. Someone recently told me that it doesn't matter if you could go back, because you'd always make the same choice again and again. You were who you were then, and you made the best decision you could at the time. Did any part of you think you were wrong when you stood up to Rutledge? Cass thought about it. He'd been nervous to do it, and the moment had come so fast, he knew he'd had to make a decision, and quick. Well, yeah. A big part of me questioned it. I wasn't sure at all. So, what pushed you over the edge? He squinted, thinking back to those tense moments on the bridge of the Atlas. Knowing that killing those Sill to take their ship was wrong. It just was. See? You couldn't have changed your mind if you wanted to. I'm not even sure if you knew at the time your actions might lead to a war that wiped out the Coalition, you still wouldn't have done it. Because you would have wanted to find another way. She paused. Tell me I'm wrong. Cass shook his head. No, I don't think you are. Plus, imagine what might have happened if instead of sending you out there to steal something, the Coalition had tried a diplomatic approach. They tried that already. It was not in the last 100 years. Who knows what might have changed in Sill society? He arched his eyebrow and stared at her, a skeptical look on his face. Okay, probably not much. I'll grant you that. But imagine if you'd met Zenfor's ship without the history of the Oculus. What might that have led to? We know the Sill are, or were, interested in the Klaxians. And if Tempest had approached them instead of your ship, or if any one of 1,000 different things had happened, we wouldn't be standing here talking about it. So don't try to shoulder the blame for all of this, because it isn't your burden to carry.
Wow, you're really passionate about this, he said.
I just don't like it when people are saddled with something that isn't their fault or their responsibility. You did what you thought was right at the time. That's all any of us can do. We can't go through life second-guessing our choices.
She turned to stare back out of the stars zooming past. He had tried not to let Asturva's words get to him, and for the most part, he'd been successful. Had it been 2 seasons earlier, and he'd just come on board Tempest and someone had accused him of what she had, he probably would have fallen into the pit of despair and wallowed in grief and remorse for much too long. But Evie was right. Some things were beyond his control, and he was just a small cog in a much larger clock. The Coalition could have approached it 100 different ways, and they'd chosen to go with lying, stealing, and killing to get what they wanted. He tried to imagine what a meeting with the Sill would have looked like had there never been an incident with the Atlas. Would the Sill even have paid them any attention? Or would they have still considered the Coalition beneath them and unwilling to speak or negotiate? He bet if they had come up with evidence of the Athru approaching and an olive branch in the form of Sester or perhaps another Klaxian, they might have been willing to talk. They didn't hide the fact they thought humanity was well beneath them. But as Zenfor had made clear, that wasn't the case with all of the Coalition's races. Had diplomacy even been an option on the table? Or had Admiral Dix or one of the other higher-ups decided it was too much of a risk and approved Rutledge's plan to attack instead? Cass was sure Rutledge himself had a say in the matter, because at the time he was one of the most decorated captains in the entire fleet. Despite all of his accomplishments, he was a classic shoot-first, ask-questions-later kind of captain, which was part of what made him so successful in the field. He was willing to take risks others weren't, and that often inspired loyalty among those under his command. Cass had almost been persuaded by that blind loyalty, right up until the end. No, Rutledge never would have suggested they try to speak to the Sill first. He would have regaled the crew with one of the tales of his great-grandfather, a lieutenant commander in the brief Sill War 100 years ago. His argument would have been humanity hadn't changed enough, that the Sill considered them little more than an annoyance and not to be bothered with. He would have said it wasn't even worth trying, because to the Sill, humanity would never advance fast enough.
What are you staring at?
Evie had turned to him again, but her eyes had narrowed. Cass hadn't realized it, because as soon as he'd begun thinking about what Rutledge would have told them, an idea had popped into his head.
You,
he said. You're the key.
Key? To what?
She asked. Thoughts were forming faster in Cass's mind than he could articulate. Evie was still human, but yet she was more. You could be exactly what the Sill are looking for. If they could convince the Sill she was still human. What had it been that Asturva said? She was stronger than either species by themselves?
Cass, what are you talking about?
Evie asked, exasperation in her voice. She was clearly done with all of it, and her mind wasn't thinking in terms of strategy. But this might be the thing that would push the Sill over the edge. Don't you see? If you stood in front of the Sill sanctuary, allowed them to see how far humans could advance, they might be willing to help us. She narrowed her eyes.
I think that's a stretch.
Is it? Think about it. The Sill value those life forms they consider advanced enough to approach their level of development. We already know they've made a treaty with the Athru, and your mother said that you possessed all the strengths of both Athru and humans, with none of the weaknesses. The Sill won't be able to deny the evidence, because you'll be standing right there in front of them. Her eyes widened, and Cass thought they might have brightened as well, though he wasn't sure. But she remained skeptical.
How am I supposed to get in front of the Sill Sanctuary?
The same way I was, Cass replied. Zenfor, Samaya, and I were going to board one of their ships and use the space beneath, as she calls it, to reach the sanctuary and make the case in person. They won't be able to refute or ignore you.
Uh-huh,
she replied.
You've already got this planned out?
We were in the middle of the strategy when Zax called me down to sickbay to inform me. He trailed off. She knew the rest. But we need to go speak to Esterva again. We need to make sure that you're not an aberration. Because you'll have to convince the Sill this evolutionary leap is repeatable. She shook her head emphatically.
Nope. No way. I'm not going back to see that woman. I don't care if it kills us all in the end.
It took all his willpower not to just grab her by the shoulders and drag her back down to the crew quarters. But she'd been burned. He couldn't forget that. Fine, I'll go. We have to send you in there with as much information as possible. If they think for a minute that you're lying...
Who says I'm agreeing to this insane plan?
She asked, crossing her arms. Cass fumbled over his words, taking a moment to get something coherent out. I thought, don't you want to stop the Athru? To drive them from Coalition space?
It's not Coalition space anymore. It's their space. They've been here for almost 20 years. Outing an enemy that entrenched will be impossible.
Not with help. Not if we can convince the Sill it is in their best interest to help us rid them from our space. It may be too late for humanity, but what about all the other races out there? The Untu, the Axinax, the Klaxians, all cut off from each other, each stranded on their own individual islands of a planet. They don't deserve this, and we're the only ones who can give them a chance. She dropped her gaze a moment, as if she were considering it. Look, I know you've resigned, or whatever you want to call it, but I know you. Despite everything that was done to you, despite everything that you've done, you still want to help. You still want to make this a better universe for future generations. And the reason I know that is because it's what I want too. We have a lot of differences, but that isn't one of them. Help me in this, please. She kept her gaze down. So long, Cass thought he might have already lost her, that all the mental and physical trauma was too much, and she was just shutting down. But no sooner did he start thinking he might have to fulfill the mission after all, Evie stared right into his eyes and smiled. 30. Are you sure about this? Cass asked as they strode down the hallway, Evie moving at a fast clip. I can speak to her myself.
No, she replied. You were right. If I'm going to confront the Sill, I need to resolve this situation before we leave. I can't have this hanging over my head out there. I'll be too distracted.
He seemed to get the point. If you're sure.
I am. Get everything in motion. The longer we're out here, the more likely we'll run into another Athru ship. We don't want to waste any more time.
She had to admit, she felt a sudden vigor running through her. It had to have been Cass pointing out she might be useful after all, that everything she'd been through hadn't been for nothing. If Evie could use her unique physiology to draw the Sill into the conflict, they might have a chance against the Athru, but none of this would be easy. Good, she thought. She didn't want it to be easy. Where was the fun in that? And there was still the matter of Sester. She couldn't leave him, not like this. They needed to get back to Klaxia Prime and help him one way or another. And the only way they could do that was if they drove straight into the heart of the Coalition itself, the Horus system. Calm me as soon as you're done, Cass said. Once I speak with Zenfor and we've plotted our course, we should be ready. She nodded, and he peeled off down an adjacent corridor as she continued down to the main crew quarters. Esterva was back in her own room, which Evie hadn't visited yet. When she reached the door and pressed the call button, it took a moment for anyone to answer. For a second, she questioned if she had the right room.
Speak.
It's me, she said, a hard edge in her voice.
Evelyn,
Esterva said. The door slid open to reveal her tall figure. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her hood was up. but Evie could see her eyes were wet with tears.
You came back.
Evie held up a hand, indicating she needed to speak.
I need information. The procedure you used to create me, could it be duplicated? And how reliably?
This forced a frown on Esturva's face.
I suppose it could. With some refinement, I'd say we could have an 84% success rate.
Evie almost pitched over. 84? Was that it?
Any way to make that better? Somewhere in the 90s, maybe? Well,
Esturva said, her head giving a small shake,
I suppose we could get it to 90 over the course of a few months, after a sufficient round of initial runs. But as with any trial, there will be more failures than successes. More subjects are likely to experience adverse effects or die until we could reliably reproduce results. Why? Because it may be the key to saving our species, Evie said. Do you plan on raising an army? Esturva asked, raising her eyebrows. Because these aren't plants, they're people. It will take them years to grow and develop. No, I just need to make sure I'm not an aberration, that more people like me can be created.
Any amusement left Esturva's face.
You are not an aberration. You're my daughter, and despite everything, I do love you. Right now, you are unique. Are you sure you want to change that?
Evie liked how Esturva slipped the L word in there, nonchalantly, like she wouldn't notice. She wasn't sure if she was fishing for reciprocation, or if that was her genuine feeling, but now was not the time.
We may not have a choice. It may be the only thing that will give us a chance to make it, she said.
Evie paused. This wasn't why she'd come here. Cass could have asked these questions. She needed to say something else.
Would you like to come in?
Esturva asked, her eyes searching Evie's.
No, this will just take a moment. I want you to know, even though I don't understand all the decisions you made, I know you were doing what you thought was best at the time. And all the bad things that resulted from those decisions, I forgive you for them.
She couldn't let those feelings fester within her anymore. She'd done that with her father for decades, and it had done no good. She wasn't going down the same path with her mother. She needed to give herself permission to let go. Otherwise, all that pain inside would eat her up. And while she didn't feel immediately better, a weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
I don't know what to say, Esturva said, other than thank you. It's probably more than I deserve. Maybe. But that's not my call to make, Evie replied. She'd gotten the information she needed. It was time to head back to the bridge and wait until they reached sill space. She turned to leave. There's one other thing,
Esturva said, and Evie cringed. If she was about to blindside her again, she might go mad.
If we do duplicate the procedure and can infuse humans and Athru together, every one of them will develop a split personality, like you did. Each of them will have to come to terms with that in their own way. Some may stay like you. Others may choose another path.
So that was the catch. Each person like her would be born with their own personal dogma inside, waiting to be unleashed. Perhaps that was something the Scylla didn't need to know, and it didn't change the fact that she was faster and stronger than any of the other Athru. It just meant there was a roadblock further on down the line. But that wasn't her primary concern at the moment. No, for now they just needed to focus on one step at a time. They would have to deal with that when and if the time ever came.
Thank you for the information.
Esturva smiled.
Can I offer you something? Tea? Humans like tea, right?
Evie shook her head.
Can't. I've got a mission. Another time, maybe.
She turned and left Esturva standing there in the doorframe. Even though Evie didn't turn back, she could feel Esturva watch her all the way down the hall. Zen, are you still in the conference room? Cass asked as he jogged down the corridor. This was too important for walking. He could walk once the Sill were on their side.
No. Commander Graydon asked me to return to engineering and await further instructions. I told him he had no authority over me, and I would do as I wished.
Cass grumbled to himself. At least it hadn't come to blows. Okay. Where are you now?
Engineering. I came to assist Lieutenant Tyler with the undercurrent calibration. We want to make sure when we run the border, we'll be able to sustain the undercurrent, even if we are hit by one of their weapons.
Cass rolled his eyes, stopping in front of a hypervator. I think we might have a solution for the sill. Evie has agreed to go with you instead.
For what purpose? She asked.
Better odds. He stepped into the hypervator. Bridge.
You believe her unique physiology will provide a stronger argument for their help, Zenfor said.
Bingo. If you can get her there, I think she can make a compelling testimony. Assuming you aren't killed immediately.
What about our agreement regarding Sester? If both of us are on the mission and things go wrong, there will be no one left to ensure he is revived.
While her voice remained commanding, there was also a bit of panic in there. I will do it. I may not have experienced the same things the two of you have, but I could speak to him. If you don't return, I promise I will find a way to save him. There was a pause on the other end.
If there is no other way, I cannot disagree. However, whereas before I put the success rate at 0%, I've revised the probability to 1%. Taking Evelyn is the smarter choice.
I'm surprised it's not 0.1, Cass thought. Thanks for the vote of confidence.
Understand, the Sill are not prone to change. The treaty has been in place a long time. Moving them to abandon it in favor of humans will be a feat to behold.
Cass tried not to take offense at the way she said humans. He understood the risks. It was either this or turn and run, and he was done running. He may not have caused the war between the Athru and the humans, but he was damn well going to do everything he could to end it. Meet Evie down in Bay 1 as soon as you're finished. We're running the border just as soon as I'm back in my seat.
You'll run the border once we have finished these calibrations, and not a minute before, she replied.
How much longer? Cass asked.
Another 30 minutes.
Fine, he replied. We don't have any time to waste. He ended the comm. He knew she meant well, but he really needed to curb her insubordination. Though calibrating the armor had been a good idea, he'd make sure to tell her after they returned from Sill space. The hypervator opened, and Cass stepped onto the bridge. Commander, you get your wish, he said to Hank, who stood as soon as he saw Cass. A confused look passed over Hank's face. Sir? Cass took the captain's chair. I'm not going to Sill space. Evie is. You're off the mission too, Samaya. We're not going to win this thing by stealing from the people we want to be allies with. The old coalition would have done that, and that's not us. Hank and Samaya exchanged glances. Cass caught Talia give him a side-eye for a second before turning back to her work. Saul and the others remained impassive. I'm not sure I understand, Hank replied. Evie is unlike any other human out there. The Sill will give her a better chance to make our case, because on an evolutionary developmental scale, she's eons ahead of us. And if they see her as worthy of preserving, they might be willing to extend that to humanity as well. But is it enough to break their treaty with the Athru? Hank asked. I hope so. But if anyone has a better idea, I'm all ears. No one else spoke up. Do we still have a position on the Bortos?
Yes, Captain, Ensign River replied. She's 10 light years from the Sill side of the border, approximately 4 hours away at our maximum speed.
Plenty of time for Zen to finish the calibrations. Lieutenant Rond, set course for the Bortos, maximum speed. He nodded, altering the trajectory of the ship toward River's destination. Cass gave Hank a reassuring smile, but he didn't see much confidence reflected in the man sitting beside him. Instead, he wore a scowl full of worry. He couldn't say he blamed him. After all they'd been through, it was natural for the crew to be suspicious, especially of such an outlandish idea. But Cass trusted Evie to get the job done. She hadn't disappointed him yet, and she knew better than anyone how high the stakes were. He just hoped all of this would be worth it. 31. The whole system could go fuck itself. Saturina Yan laid on top of her space wing, her hands back behind her head as she stared up at Bay 2's ceiling some 60 meters above her. Flat against her ship like this, she'd be hard to spot from the ground. The only ones who could readily see her were the flight controllers up in the tower. Anyone else would be on the ground, and the height of the ship should block her from view. "Hey, rings!" Saturina cursed under her breath and didn't move. Maybe if she stayed perfectly still, no one would notice. There was no evidence she'd been spotted. Ryan could just be trying his luck. Maybe she was in the mess hall, or back in her quarters, sleeping. Though ever since she'd taken over operations of the remaining pilots and become chief, her quarters had seemed more like a cell in itself, with pilots coming by during all hours of the day needing her to sign requisition forms, or approve a parts replacement, or go over a new training schedule. Had they been this needy when Raffinkel had been running things? There was no way. She hadn't bothered the chief more than a handful of times, and each one of those had been a genuine emergency. Okay, maybe a few were more frivolous. But that was the point of a chief, right? To make sure the group ran smoothly? How did Cass do it, with more than 120 people under his command? "I'll tell you how," her inner voice said. "Department heads." That's what she needed. Someone who could filter all this crap and only bring her the most important stuff. The only problem was, the only person she really trusted to delegate it to was Dorsey, and he was the worst one of them all. "Yo, I see you up there. Don't pretend like you're part of the ship," he called again. She sat up and contorted her face into a visage of a demon. "What now?" He hooked a thumb back behind him. "Utley has a blown iodine compressor. She needs you to sign off on a new one from the quartermaster." If he even saw her expression, he made no acknowledgement of it. In his other hand, he held a small data pad, probably with a request on it. "I swear to Core," Saturina said, hopping down on the wing of the ship, then stepping on the footholds along the neck until she reached the ladder and climbed down. "If one more of you comes to me with something as simple as, 'She needs it for the ship,' what's she supposed to do? Fly without one?" Saturina snatched the small data pad out of Dorsey's hand. "Tell her to quit fucking with her intakes until we aren't on call. If we need to scramble right now, she couldn't get off the ground, could she?" Dorsey shrugged. "You know how she is. Likes to tinker." Saturina grumbled, stomping past him. "What about the order?" he called. "I'll take it there myself," she said over her shoulder. "Give me a few minutes of peace away from you lot." As soon as this mission was over, she was turning in her resignation as Space Corps chief. She hadn't wanted the job in the first place, and this was exactly why. Cass should have known better. Maybe he should assign Utley to take over, see how she liked being on the receiving end for once. Although, knowing her, she'd probably end up sucking the spare parts division dry doing all her upgrades. Saturina made her way across into Bay 1. It was easier than exiting through the main corridor that connected to Bay 2, since most of the primary cargo bays were on this side of the ship. But she stopped short as soon as she caught sight of who was already in there, inspecting one of the transport shuttles. The woman looked up, apparently having heard Saturina. "Chief Yan, I haven't had the chance to give you my congratulations on your promotion." The former captain of the Tempest stood there with her hand extended for Saturina to shake. Saturina looked at it and stiffened instead. "Yeah, thanks." Diazol dropped her hand, resettling her face, but not before her cheeks flushed red. Saturina immediately felt bad about not shaking her hand. But that hand had killed 7 people who would otherwise be alive if it weren't for her. "Right, well," she said, filling the silence between them. She probably assumed Saturina agreed with the pilot still in the brig. But Saturina wouldn't consider those traitors her friends. They had tried to take over the ship, with Raffinkel herself trying to murder Diazol. Saturina didn't want her former captain dead, but that didn't mean she needed to interact with her. But she had to admit it was odd seeing her in civilian clothes instead of her uniform.
It's just, she said, waiting a beat for Diazol to reply with something snarky, but she didn't. It's tough to get past what you did. Diazol dropped her eyes. That's something we share. Her candor struck Saturina. She had to remember one of those people Diazol had killed had been, as Cass described her, someone special to Diazol. Saturina wasn't sure if that meant romantic or not, but based on the ashy gray her former captain's face had gone, it was hard to assume otherwise. But, Diazol added, her voice uncharacteristically bubbly, you probably won't have to deal with it much longer. What do you mean? Diazol indicated the shuttle behind her. Mission. Going to try and negotiate with the Sill. So, as you can guess, there's a pretty good chance I won't be coming back. That's not necessarily true. Cass came back. Diazol forced a laugh. Yeah, that's Cass. I think we can assume it was a one-time thing. My luck hasn't been so good. Saturina wasn't sure what else to say. Had she taken on this mission because she felt guilty about what she'd done? Or did she have a death wish? And why was Saturina being so hard on her? It wasn't like Diazol had done it purposely. If she had, she wouldn't be feeling so guilty. And she probably wouldn't have voluntarily given up command of the ship. Look, I'm sorry. There's just been so much. She made a gesture with a hand holding the datapad. It's a lot. Tell me about it, she replied. I hope your mission is successful, Saturina added. I'd like to see you make it back in one piece. She thought about it a moment, then held out her hand. Diazol's eyes widened, and a small smile played on her face as she took it. Thanks. I hope you make some progress on moving the pilots in the brig to more permanent quarters. Don't let Cass give you the runaround. He'll put it off because he thinks they deserve to be there. But it's inhumane. For the second time in less than a few minutes, Diazol's humanity surprised Saturina. Even though the pilots in the brig hated her guts, she still wanted to make sure they were taken care of. She probably still saw them as part of her crew, even if they blamed her for every bad thing that had happened to them. Could that be what made her such a good captain, before everything had happened? I'll remember that, Saturina said. Diazol gave her one last quick smile before turning back toward the shuttle. At the far end of the room, Saturina saw Zenfor enter, headed toward the same shuttle. They were going off together on a mission to try and negotiate with a foe, and neither of them were official crew members. Saturina took a deep breath and nodded to Zenfor, who returned the gesture. Then she returned to Bay 2 instead of heading off to the quartermaster. That was fast, Dorsey said, spread-eagled on the ground beside his own space wing, working on one of the landing struts. I've decided to help Utley with a compressor. Those things can be repaired with a little elbow grease. Care to assist? Dorsey hopped up. Sure. Anything you need, Chief. Despite everything, she had a good crew. Maybe she wouldn't turn in her resignation until after those new quarters for the pilots were finished. Evie to Cass, we're ready down here. Acknowledged, Cass replied. Stand by. We're approaching the Sill border now. He cut the comm and stared at the screen ahead of them, its grid display showing their relative position to the edge of Sill space. They weren't far now. If the Athru ships were out there blockading the border, they would know very soon. We are no longer detecting the disturbances we saw further out, Ron said. That may be a consistent trait in their time bubbles. We can see them from far away, but not up close. That tracked with what they knew from Starbase 5's telescopes. Cass was no expert in relativity, so he had no idea how something like that might work, but it sounded plausible enough for him to go with, for now. As far as he was concerned, he had to expect there were a ton of Athru ships sitting right on the edge of Sill space, waiting for them. Priorities. Maintain the undercurrent. Under no circumstance are we to slow down. If we have to leave the current, they'll have us. We've seen what their weapons can do to planets and stars. Let's not give them a chance to use them on us. Second, reaching the Bortos. I don't know if the Athru ships will cross the border, but I'm betting they won't want to piss off the only other species in the quadrant that can go toe-to-toe with them in a battle. Sir, Rivers said, The boathouse has changed position and is heading toward us. The other 2 ships have moved to intercept us as well.
Sounds like they still are getting nervous. We might actually try something, Hank said.
Will they reach us before we get to the border? Cass asked. No, sir, but based on our current trajectories, we won't have more than 2 or 3 minutes to engage the boathouse before we have to return to the undercurrent. Otherwise, we risk being overwhelmed by the sill ships.
Christ, Cass said under his breath.
Evie, did you catch that?
We caught it all right, Evie replied,
a sour note in her voice.
We'll be ready.
Approaching the border, Ron said.
Weapons? Cass asked.
Talia glanced up.
Fully charged and ready.
But the only thing that will stop them is the transdimensional weapon, I know. We're not using that here. Using it this close to sill space gives them a very good reason to not even let us reach the boathouse. And I don't want to let another one of those creatures loose. He nodded to her. Do the best you can.
Yes, sir.
Talia gritted her teeth and input a sequence into her controls. She was as steady as they came. Cass tapped his comm.
Jan? Are you aware of the situation out here?
I've been reading my feeds, she replied. You need us?
Maybe. Station 2 Space Wings at Bay 2's opening. You might need to give the shuttle some cover fire. But you are not, and I repeat, are not to leave the bay. The only ship I want out there is the shuttle.
We can do that.
There was a shuffling in the background.
I've got them moving into position now. How long until our target?
Cass glanced at River. She held up all 10 of her fingers, 5 of which split into half to make 15 in total.
Assuming we make it past the border, another 15 minutes.
We'll be ready,
she replied. Thanks. Cass out. He looked over to Samaya. Engineering?
Ready as we can be. Tyler has everything.
A massive blast cut her off mid-sentence as the ship rocked back and forth.
It came out of nowhere, Talia said. Just a glancing blow. We're still in the undercurrent.
Athru ship at 12N, Mark 0. A second ship at 45.6, Mark 18. Third ship at -61, Mark 7, Zal reported. On the screen in front of them, Cass saw the distinctive outlines of 3 black ships ahead of them. That was a blockade, all right.
Adjusting heading, Rond replied. We should be able to squeeze through 2 of them.
Watch it, Isaac, River said. -61 is moving to compensate.
They're firing, Talia yelled. Cass gripped the armrest on his chair. Evasive. The image ahead of them swung wildly as they changed directions, the green undercurrent still enveloping the moving stars.
Undercurrent is holding, but barely,
Samaya said. Throw everything you've got at them, Talia. Let's see if we can't distract them. She nodded in response. Rond, do we have a way through? Still searching for one, Captain. It seems like they'd rather let us kamikaze one of their ships than give us a clear path.
It makes sense, Hank said. If we're the last ones, what is the sacrifice of one Athru ship to end the human plague?
I think you're right, Cass said, which just made this much more dangerous. He neglected to consider the Athru might do anything to stop them. He turned around to look at Talia. Any luck?
Maybe some, but they're keeping up with us, forming a barrier wherever we want to go through. If we're having any effect on them, it's negligence. Incoming!
On it, Rond yelled, and the ship swung again. On the screen ahead of them, the green glow disappeared.
We're out of the undercurrent, back at sublight speeds,
Samaya said. She smashed the control system in front of her.
Tyler!
I know, he yelled back through the comm. Stand by. The Athru ships have slowed to sublight as well, and are closing, Zal said. We're back up, Tyler yelled. Cass pitched forward in his seat. Go! The green glow reappeared and enveloped the ship. The stars outside zoomed by.
Ha!
Ron said, cheering.
I used our momentum when we were thrown from the undercurrent to get out and around them. They're behind us.
Holy shit, Talia said, her eyes wide on her own console.
Captain, behind us.
Rear viewer, Cass said. The screen switched to the rear view, showing a bevy of energy weapons being fired at them. To Cass, it looked like the same weapon they'd used to destroy the Bulak homeworld. What can you do? Talia stared at him, shock on her face. A blast like that would tear through their armor like it was aluminum. Anyone? Cass asked. He estimated they had maybe 15 seconds before that energy pulse caught up with them. Leave it to me, sir, Rond said. He turned in his seat to Samaya. I need you to cut the undercurrent for 1.7 seconds and then reinitialize on my mark. Samaya glanced at Cass. He nodded his approval. Rond turned in his seat again. Mark. Tempest dropped out of the undercurrent as Rond pitched them down along the Z-axis, throwing the ship into an acrobatic flip Cass hadn't thought possible. He checked his own instruments to monitor the ship's movement through space. Had they been in an atmosphere, the shearing forces would have ripped the ship in two. But Rond managed to expertly pilot the ship in a complex series of movements that took it out of the way of the energy blast, while at the same time they crossed into Sill territory. Initializing, Samaya said, and the green glow returned as the ship slipped back into the undercurrent. Cass saw the energy blast go by on the screen at an odd angle. Confirmation we've passed into Sill space, Rivers said. We're back to speed, Rond added. They shouldn't be able to catch us. Cass turned to Talia. Any sign of pursuit? She shook her head. He'd been right. The Athru were scared of the Sill and didn't want to violate their border. Good news, Captain. I believe I can absolve the Sturva of any blame regarding our last encounter with the Athru, Zal said. Comparing the two incidents leaves less than a 0.05% chance she exposed our location to the Athru. Great, thanks, Cass said. Frankly, he didn't give two shits about its Sturva right now. He just wanted to make sure this operation had the best chance of success possible. Time to the Bortos? At their current speed, River said, we'll meet in 8 minutes.
32.
Shuttle Cytherin? Less than 8 minutes.
Evie stared at the computer, pursing her lips in distaste, despite no one other than Zenfor being able to see her. They'd had a line open on everything happening so far. She didn't need to be told when to be ready.
Space Wing units are in position, Jan's voice added, ready to provide cover fire.
Evie turned in her seat to look at Zenfor, who was going over some last-minute checks on the shuttle.
Give it to me straight. What are the odds we actually make it to the sanctuary? Abysmal, Zenfor said without looking up. Then why are you going? Because you don't know the way. Without a proper understanding of the space beneath, you would be hopelessly lost forever. But why risk your life for this? You could stay on Tempest. What do you get out of it?
Zenfor had always been something of a conundrum to Evie. She had never officially joined the crew, and yet she'd become indispensable. In some ways, she was better than all of them, because she voluntarily put herself on the line for the crew, rather than doing it out of some sense of duty, which had been all that had driven Evie at one point in her life.
The Sill are wrong, and they need to change. They need to grow. And sometimes the only way to make that happen is through force.
Evie supposed that was good enough for her. She hadn't had many interactions with the former council, but it struck her that here they were, two former captains of their respective ships, working together to save what remained of the coalition.
I know how you feel. I feel like humanity, or what's left of it, needs to change too. We've grown too complacent for our own good. The backdoor dealings of the coalition were proof of that. Atrocities were committed and then swept under the rug. That was not what I signed up to pledge my life to.
Then it seems we are both in a position to accomplish our goals, she replied.
Yeah, as long as we don't die first.
Evie thought she saw the hint of a smile in Zenfor's face, but it was fleeting.
Cytherin, 3 minutes. We better move the shuttle into position, Evie said.
Without an objection from her passenger, she maneuvered the shuttle at low power down to the end of Bay 1, setting it down at the edge of the bay. Beyond the edge of the force barrier, the stars flew by with a green tinge to them.
I've always liked the way stars look in the undercurrent, she said absently.
Zenfor didn't reply, but that was all right. Perhaps she didn't see them the same way, but they were beautiful. River's voice came through the comm.
Contact in 3, 2, 1.
Evie's heart rate picked up as she positioned her hands over the controls again. They'd only get one shot at this, and they couldn't afford to miss. Outside, the green glow disappeared, and the stars returned to normal. No sooner were they out of the undercurrent Then did they begin making evasive maneuvers. Evie caught the edge of a sill ship fly by in the distance.
"Did you see it?" she asked. "I saw it."
The lack of energy blasts outside concerned her. Shouldn't they be locked in combat by now? All she could see was the sill ship swipe past the opening as Tempest continued to move erratically.
"I estimate the board host has already engaged one of its gravity nets. If Caspian is shrewd enough, he should be able to get them to initialize 2 more. Then we will begin."
Right. The gravity nets. Evie didn't understand exactly how they worked, other than somehow the sill localized areas of space where the mass of a given object was turned inward on itself, like a black hole. A ship could end up crushing itself within the affected area, and as far as she knew, there was no way out other than for the sill to disengage the field.
"You should call them heavy mass nets instead,"
she said, trying to keep the nervousness out of her voice. Her hands remained poised over the controls. Zenfor looked at her for a moment, then returned her attention to her own controls.
"Space Wings, begin cover fire. Evie, go,"
Cass yelled through the comm. Evie slipped into combat mode, and her nerves steeled, her hands executing a perfect launch from the end of the bay. They flew out into woven space as the energy weapons from the Space Wings still in Bay 2 lit up space all around them. Evie plotted a course to the Bortos, finding it on her scanner easily.
"Tempest sent the locations of the gravity nets," Zenfor said. "Avoid these 3 areas."
The information scrolled across Evie's screen.
Easy enough, she thought.
She flipped the shuttle back and forth to throw off any enemy targeting sensors, careful to mind the volley of blasts coming from both the Space Wings and now Tempest as well. It almost seemed too easy. A shudder ripped through the shuttle, nearly throwing Evie out of her seat.
"Hull breach," she yelled.
This wasn't good. A blast from the sill ship had torn right through the primary hull plating on the port side of the shuttle. It was a miracle they weren't venting atmosphere yet, but the pressure wouldn't hold much longer. Not to mention, they lost all engine control and were spinning through space, still headed toward the sill ship. The shot had clipped them, and the inertia from the speed of the shuttle did the rest. Without engines, she wouldn't be able to regain control before they hit the ship, if the hull integrity even held. She'd trained on simulations like this before, and while sometimes recovery was possible in the sims, it rarely happened in real life. There were just too many variables. Evie tried rebooting the engines, only for a flashing red light to go off.
"Damn. The primary control conduit has been severed," she said.
She glanced up, space spinning in an almost perfect circle out the window.
"Is there no chance to regain control?"
Zenfor asked. A hissing sound from somewhere near the back grew loud enough for Evie to realize they were venting atmosphere. The cabin would fail from that point.
"No, the backups are offline," she said.
Zenfor jumped up and grabbed Evie out of the chair, holding her to Zenfor's massive chest with one arm.
"What are you doing?" "It's our only chance to survive," Zenfor said. "What is?"
Zenfor walked to the back of the shuttle, still holding Evie with one arm. She opened the rear hatch. A wobble had developed in the shuttle's trajectory, and it now spun wildly, the sill ship only visible every couple of seconds.
"We have to jump. We won't make it otherwise."
"Into space?" Evie said.
"I'll suffocate or freeze to death before we get 10 meters. I'm not built like you are."
Zenfor had shown how she could sustain long periods in extreme cold and without air, back when she'd had to repair Tempest's engines, and the section was open to the vacuum of space. But that wasn't Evie. She wished she brought one of Reach's personal repel fields.
"No choice," Zenfor said. "Hold your breath." "But—"
Before she could finish the sentence, Zenfor jumped through the force barrier, and a shock of cold hit Evie's skin, going straight through her clothes. For a second, she thought the suddenness of it would cause her to cry out. But everything around them had gone completely silent. It wasn't quiet. Instead, it was the absence of sound. And while, yes, she was freezing, she didn't feel her skin crystallizing yet. So that had to be a good thing. Zenfor had jumped at exactly the right time, as the two of them were aimed directly at the sill ship. Evie glanced up at the shuttle in time to see it rip itself in half, exposing the crew portion they'd been standing in only seconds before. The air inside had finally decompressed the cabin where it had been weakened by the blast. The decompression threw the shuttle off in a wildly different direction, and it tumbled into the darkness out of sight. Evie still couldn't believe she wasn't dead. But what really amazed her was just how beautiful everything was out here. With no barriers between her and space, she felt like she was part of it in some way. And the beauty of the stars, the ships, even the energy blasts around them reached out to her, beckoning her to stay. Zenfor tapped her on the shoulder and pointed to the sill ship, which loomed large in front of them. Zenfor put her one free hand and both feet out, and Evie did the same, noticing her exposed hands still hadn't begun to form ice crystals in the skin, though they were changing color. What was going on? She should be a block of solid ice by now. But somehow her body was holding its temperature. The sill ship approached fast, and Zenfor hit the surface. She absorbed most of the impact, and Evie felt a rumble vibrate through her, like a grunt. But the silence around them allowed no noise. Quickly, Zenfor scrambled across the side of the ship, finding small handholds in different areas, and propelling herself forward until they reached a small hatch. She motioned for Evie to grab onto a hold while she addressed the door. Evie did, noticing her hands had gone sort of an ashy gray color. The exact same color as Athru's skin. Was this one of their latent abilities? Resistance to cold? Zenfor closed her eyes and placed a palm against the center of the hatch. Pressure formed to the back of Evie's throat, and she felt like she wouldn't be able to hold her breath much longer. Just as she thought she might start seeing spots, the hatch opened slowly, and Zenfor grabbed Evie by the arm, tossing her inside. Zenfor followed, and the doors closed behind them. There was a whoosh of air. Evie's ears popped, and she sucked in a deep breath. Inside, it was pitch black. She couldn't see a thing.
Zenfor?
She asked, breathless.
I'm here,
she replied.
What happened?
She continued to take in big gulps of breath.
I had to convince the ship to allow us entry. Whether Bortos decides to keep our presence a secret or not, I can't say. She might decide to reveal us. Ships can be testy sometimes. I can't believe I'm not dead.
Evie held her hands up to see if they were still gray, hoping a sliver of light would emerge from somewhere. But there was nothing. They'd gone from an absence of sound to an absence of light.
Can you see? No, she replied, but I don't need to. Take my hand and follow me.
Evie stood, crouching at first to make sure she wouldn't hit her head. She fumbled in the darkness for Zenfor, focusing on where her voice had come from, until she found her shoulder. She ran her hand down her arm until Zenfor's large hand closed on hers and pulled her further into the darkness.
Did they make it?
Cass asked, turning to his crew one by one.
What happened?
I'm showing the shuttle decompressed after taking the hit, Saul said. It is currently tumbling through space, but I detect no life forms aboard.
They jumped,
Talia said. They what? Cass asked.
Sensors showed 2 heat signatures leaving the shuttle right before it decompressed, heading for the sill ship. They landed on the surface and disappeared, Talia continued. Were they both alive? Unknown, but they were cooling fast when they landed. I can tell you that much. Sir, River said, the 2 large sill ships are close. Our encounter at the sill border cost us precious time here.
We'll just have to hope for the best, Cass said. Helm, get us out of here, any course. Just make sure that Bortos follows us. We can't lose it.
Aye,
Ron said, activating the undercurrent again. They took off, but without using Zenfor's upgrades, so the sill ships could keep pace.
All 3 sill ships are confirmed to be behind us now, sir.
Cass slumped back in his seat. He was exhausted.
I have to point out, Captain, Talia said, the longer we stay in sill space, the more likely we are to run into more of their ships. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't have a small armada behind us before long.
What are you saying, Ensign? Hank asked.
We may have to leave sill space before Diazol and Zenfor can finish their mission, especially if the sill try to corner us.
Cass ran his hand down his face.
Look at it this way, Samaya said. At least now you can finally say you've fired on one of their ships, on purpose.
A grin spread across her face. Very funny, Cass replied. He silently wished Zenfor and Evie safe travels. He didn't know how, but he felt like they'd survived that jump, as crazy as it had been. Now all they needed was a little time and a lot of luck. 33. They'd been walking in complete darkness for at least 5 minutes. The only reason Evie knew this was because she'd been counting her breaths, keeping time with how many times she would breathe in and out in a given minute. It was surprisingly regular. Beneath her feet, the floor was hard, like deck plating, but it wasn't as regular. Instead, it had more of an organic feel to it. She'd refrained from saying anything because she hadn't wanted to alert any sill that might be around them. Nor did she want the ship itself to listen in to their conversations. She wasn't sure how sentient the ship was, or how much it understood, but she wasn't going to take any unnecessary risks. Somehow they made it this far, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes from here on out. Ahead of her, Zenfor stopped, and Evie hung back. She still clung to Zenfor's hand, afraid if she let go, she'd never be able to find it again, and she'd never find her way out of this labyrinth. Cass had tried to describe the experience of walking through a sill ship to her, but until she'd experienced the phenomenon for herself, it was hard to imagine. He said he'd spent a lot of time fumbling around in the dark, but having light wasn't much better, as, except for the bridge, there were no windows or sources of anything to look at. Evie thought she'd lose it if she couldn't see the stars every day. Finally, a twinge of reddish light appeared in her vision. At first, it was little more than a dull glow, but it grew brighter. Evie almost asked what it was, except as it moved toward them, Zenfor ushered them backward. Evie could finally see the hallway they were in now. It was oddly symmetrical, and yet not. Above her, 2 long white bars were suspended in what looked to be a pinkish material. All around them, the walls and floor were a dull gray. Zenfor hunched down, and Evie followed suit, until she saw the source of the light. It was a sill, clad in their uniform. Above them, a red crystal was situated over their head, glowing so bright Evie had to shield her dilated eyes. It passed by through an adjacent corridor without looking over at Zenfor or Evie, its feet barely touching the ground as it moved. It looked to be as tall as Zenfor, but only about half her weight. Evie was silently thankful Zenfor was on their side. Evie took the opportunity to look at her hands. Thankfully, they'd returned to their previous color. She was glad whatever had happened hadn't been permanent. The red light faded as the sill moved further down the corridor, and Zenfor ushered them forward. They reached the same corridor it had appeared from, and took off in the opposite direction until they arrived at what looked like a portal in the wall, though it was hard to tell, as what little light remained from the sill faded fast. "Here," Zenfor said, "the space beneath." Before Evie could ask a question, Zenfor stepped through, with Evie in tow. For a brief second, she was cold, then warm again. There was still no light in here, but she felt as if they'd passed through more than just an ordinary doorway. The air was different, not stale, but it had a distinctive taste to it Evie couldn't place. And there was a faint smell of sulfur in the air. She felt Zenfor's hand fall away, and for a second, Evie panicked, until a bright light illuminated the space. Evie shielded her eyes for a moment, before they adjusted to see Zenfor had brought along the emergency flashlight from the kit in the shuttle. She strapped it to her arm and examined the tunnel they'd come in. Behind Evie was the same portal they'd come through, though its surface was pitch black and featureless, like a piece of rubber had been stretched across it. Zenfor reached out and touched the side of the wall. "We've come out in a good place," she said. "I was afraid we'd have to exit on another ship or station and find a closer point of entry, but this will do." "How can you tell where we are?" Evie asked. "It's something we've developed over time, an internal compass, though it's more complex than that. But I know we don't have far to go." "And we're not in my universe anymore?" Evie asked. "No.
This is an adjacent dimension, smaller, stranger.
Her light shone on the walls, which reflected a light purple color. They were ridged, like they'd been made by some kind of machine, as if the entire tunnel had been dug.
What's on the other side of these walls?
Evie asked. Zenfor began walking along the tunnel, shining the light in front of her. Evie kept up.
Nothing but the void. It isn't pleasant on the other side. Few still have ventured beyond the safety of the tunnels. Of those that have, none have ever returned.
Then how do you know it's unpleasant?
The collectors, Zenfor said. Those who gather the negative mass particles. They stand at the precipice of the void and gather them for our weapons. Imagine looking out to an endless abyss and being filled with sensations of dread, hopelessness, and despair. And imagine feeling as if stepping off into that void was your only choice. It is why the collectors must be restrained at all times. Otherwise, they would walk right off. It makes me glad I was born a consul.
I bet, Evie replied.
This way, Zenfor said, continuing down the corridor. They traveled for only a few minutes before reaching a 4-way intersection. In the middle was a small raised platform made of what looked like stone with some writing on it. Zenfor skirted it without a second glance, continuing straight. Moments later, they reached another one. This one a 6-way, and another stone marker in the middle.
What are these? Evie asked.
The oldest parts of the space beneath are closest to the sanctuary itself. From millennia ago, when we first discovered this place.
The way Cass made it sound was like you were from here.
He was mistaken,
Zenfor said, no emotion in her voice. Beyond the 6-way was a large archway with the same black membrane. Evie noticed Zenfor hesitate. Then she took a breath and stepped through, motioning for Evie to do the same. It was a good thing Evie had already begun walking toward it, because as soon as Zenfor was gone, so was the light, and she was thrown into pitch black once again. She felt the same cold that she had when she'd come through the first time, but this time emerged into a large hallway, which curved away from them in both directions. Evie glanced up to see there was no roof, only stars in the darkness of space. But anything was preferable to the absolute night that had been down there and in the sill ship. Despite it being night, the sky was tinged purple.
Space, she said. We are on Thisleia, Zenfor replied, keeping her voice to a whisper. Walk softly. We must be quick.
This is your homeworld? Evie asked.
The air had a tangy bite to it, like it had been infused with an aroma Evie had never smelled before. If she had to place it, she would say it was the smell of the sea, but different. Though the air was fresh and rejuvenating. Fresher than anything she'd ever breathed in. Immediately, Evie felt invigorated. Zenfor crept along without answering, keeping to the wall while Evie followed. Every few moments, she'd look up at the giant open structure above them, just to stare at the stars. She'd never seen them so clear from the surface of a planet before. Usually, light pollution got in the way.
Where are we?
In the sanctuary temple in the capital city, Zenfor replied.
Then where is everyone?
The temple is often empty, except for the council members, their aides, and other important people.
No guards?
No Sil is stupid enough to try what we are about to attempt.
Zenfor's voice had dropped even lower.
Which is what?
To interrupt the sanctuary itself.
She paused.
Are you ready?
Evie couldn't say if she was or not. But what was she going to do? Turn back now? She nodded.
Then run as fast as you can.
With that, Zenfor stood and sprinted down the corridor. Evie stayed right on her heels. The Sil should be able to outpace her, but thanks to Asturva, Evie had no problem piling on the speed. As Zenfor turned a corner and led her through an archway that had to be 40 meters high, she couldn't help but think what would have happened had Cass tried to do this. Would Zenfor have carried him on her back? She almost laughed in spite of herself. They ran down a long corridor with a series of massive archways on each side, all of them overlooking a landscape beyond. All of a sudden, Evie realized just how high they were. The bridge they were running across had to be at least 200 meters in the air, judging from the size of the lights in the distance. No wonder the stars were so clear up here. Beyond them, on her left, was complete darkness. But from the light of the city and stars, Evie could just barely make out the edge of a large sea brushing up against the shore. It had been the ocean she smelled after all. "Keep up," Zenfor said, and Evie realized she'd slowed to admire the view. She redoubled her efforts and caught up with Zenfor easily as they passed through another 40-meter-high archway. Evie stopped short, just behind Zenfor. Spread out in front of them were no less than 200 seats, each with a sill seated, all of them staring in the opposite direction toward a small stage beyond the audience. They were arranged in a semicircle, ending at the same place on both sides, so the back half of the room was open to the elements. It overlooked the city beyond, and offered no guardrail or protection for anyone standing near the back of the stage. Someone could walk right off into oblivion if they wished. Above them, an open ceiling supported by only a few long struts extended out to above the stage. Evie figured they must not get much rain on Thisleia. The interesting thing was some of the sill and the seats were still clad in their suits with their glowing gems, while others were like Zenfor and wore robes or other clothes. If Evie had to guess, she'd say perhaps only a third of the sill were in the black uniforms. But the myriad of colors coming from the gems spanned the rainbow, from magenta all the way to cyan. On the stage was a sill standing behind what Evie could only imagine was their version of a podium, though it seemed to have grown from the ground like a tree trunk, rather than just placed there in the middle where they could all see. They spoke in a language Evie couldn't understand, but abruptly stopped upon laying eyes on her and Zenfor. "Come," Zenfor said, leading Evie down the main aisle. They made their way down the aisle slowly, as if in the presence of a group of predators that might pounce if they made any sudden movements. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her as it had gone dead silent. The only sound was the light shuffle of a turning head or someone shifting in their seat. The speaker at the front stepped back from the podium and raised their left hand, looking to the right side of the stage. Someone from the crowd spoke, but Evie still didn't understand the words. Then someone else said something she did understand. "Human." From the right side of the stage, where the sill speaker had been looking, appeared two sill, both as large, if not larger, than Zenfor herself. "Disable them," Zenfor said. "What?" Evie asked. "Incapacitate them, or we die." The guards moved toward them, and as soon as one put his hand on Evie, she grabbed it, twisting it back and snapping it. There was a murmur of shock through the crowd as the sill grimaced, but he wasn't deterred. He reached out with his other fist to punch Evie, but she avoided it easily, shoving her foot into his abdomen. There was an audible crunch, and he doubled over, clutching himself. Now that his face was in range, she bent over and pulled back with her fist, shoving it into his face with all the power she could muster. Another crack, and the sill's body went limp, tumbling off the front of the stage. The second guard, who had grabbed Zenfor, stared at her with eyes wide. He let go of his charge and approached Evie. But before he could make a move, she shot forward and planted the heel of her foot into his knee, breaking it. He screamed and crumpled at once, grasping the injury with both hands. There was another series of shocked expressions from the crowd. Sill stood up, yelling things Evie didn't understand. The second guard seemed sufficiently incapacitated, so she stepped back beside Zenfor. Behind her, a soft breeze blew through the open space, ruffling the back of her hair. For some strange reason, she thought of the facility on Cypaxia. Zenfor held up both hands and began speaking in what Evie could only assume was the primary Sill language. It was a flowing language with lots of vowels, and Evie understood none of it. She expected she'd hear a proper noun thrown in there somewhere, but it all came across as foreign. The Sill that had stood in anger sat back down, while the person who had been speaking disappeared for a moment, then returned with a small device. He handed it to Zenfor, who gave it to Evie.
"Speak into this," Zenfor said. "It will transmit what is said back to you as well."
Evie turned it over in her hand. It was an old, clumsy piece of technology. She wondered how long it had been since someone other than a Sill addressed what she had to assume was the sanctuary in front of her. The eyes of every Sill in the room, Zenfor included, were glued to her. Evie stepped forward, raised the device, and spoke. 34. "Mr. Rond?" Cass said, with some strain in his voice. He was back on the edge of his seat, watching the screen ahead of them. "Working on it, Captain. Their ships are maneuverable." "You can say that again," Hank said. "Lieutenant, engage pattern echelon." "Aye," Rond said. The ship whipped and twisted around the pursuing ships. Talia had been right. More Sill had been called to assist. In addition to the Bortos and the other two, 3 more ships had joined the fray. If they had to wait too much longer, they wouldn't have a choice but to engage Zenfor's advanced drive and leave Sill space. But Cass didn't like the odds of trying to find the Bortos again after they left. It would be like abandoning Evie and Zenfor. They had to hold out as long as possible. "That will buy us a few minutes at least," Hank said, winking at Cass. "I used to use that back in my academy days to get away from the security patrols when we make a run to Outpost Alpha. They could never keep up."
"Hank, I never knew you were such a wild child in your youth," Samaya said.
"Learn something new every day." Cass was glad to have him along. His evasive pattern seemed to have bought them a few extra minutes anyway. It was so hard to tell what could work in the undercurrent, because physics in here got weird. That was on purpose. Traversing space faster than light was a delicate operation, and Cass didn't like how much they were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Their next move could be the one that tore the ship into a billion tiny fragments, and any hope for the future along with it.
"They're closing again," Ron said. "Sir, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up."
"We'll keep it up as long as possible," Cass replied. "I know it sucks, but you got this, Isaac."
"Yes, sir."
Behind him, Cass heard the hypervator doors open. When he turned, for a moment he forgot himself and didn't recognize the person coming onto the bridge. He was lost in thought back to when Zenfor had appeared, pummeling the 2 traitorous members of their crew for their attempted mutiny. But instead of Zenfor, who obviously couldn't be there, stood Asturva, her hands clasped in front of her and her hood down. "Security breach," Hank said. Cass put up his hand, standing to face her. "What are you doing on the bridge?"
"I wish to be of assistance," she replied.
Cass couldn't see any deception in her face, but that didn't mean anything. It was entirely possible she'd come up here to kill them all and take the ship for herself. Wasn't she supposed to have a guard? Either she killed him, or Evie forgot to assign her one before she left. "Saul, do we have any missing crew members?" Cass asked. He tapped a button on his controls. "Other than Ms. Diazol and Zenfor, everyone is accounted for." "And alive?" Cass asked.
"I'm insulted," Asturva replied. "If I'd wanted to kill you, I wouldn't be standing on your bridge. I would have cut your life support systems and waited for you to suffocate to death. It would have been much easier."
She must have seen something on Cass's face that amused her, because her grin reached her eyes, and she stifled a laugh.
"I'm only kidding, of course."
"You should return to your quarters before I have you escorted to the brig," Hank said.
"I may be of assistance. Don't overlook my potential contribution," Asturva replied.
"Which is what?" Cass asked.
"The Sill have a treaty with the Athru, correct? I am an Athru. Perhaps they will not be willing to destroy a ship with their ally aboard."
"Unless they've already communicated to the Sill who you really are," Cass said. "We still don't know those traitors from Sisk didn't tell the Athru about your appearance, and they could have related to the Sill." Her face became stern.
"Unlikely. They would never want to reveal cracks in their perfect union. As far as anyone outside the Athru is concerned, every Athru is united in their endeavor.
They will not have told the Sill.
Cass glanced first to Samaya, then to Hank. Do you really think they'll listen?
There's only one way to find out, Esterva replied. Allow me to help.
Aren't you afraid I'll make another mistake? That my judgment will put all of us in peril? She stepped forward.
I had some time to reflect on your words. You were right about me. I have made some questionable decisions in the past, and it was unfair of me to lay the entire war at your feet. You had a role, yes, but you are not wholly responsible, just as I had my own role in not informing the coalition of us sooner. Perhaps things would have turned out different if I had.
Cass had to admit he hadn't expected that from her. Thank you, he said.
All any of us can do is our best with what we have at the time. As long as we do that, no one can fault us. Now, allow me to do my best right now with my advantage. If it doesn't work, you can always go back to avoiding energy blasts.
Cass nodded, indicating for her to come to the front of the bridge and face the screen. Zal, open a comm to the Sill ships. He could see his ops officer was about to object, but he cut him off. I don't care if they don't respond. Just broadcast on all channels. Aye, Zal said in his deep monotone. Begin whenever you're ready, Cass said. Esterva took a deep breath and spoke.
I know I don't belong here, and I'm not welcome, Evie said, standing before the Sill. But as you have seen, I am no ordinary human. I ask you to hear my case, my evidence, then make a judgment based on all of the information. Otherwise, you are being willfully ignorant.
There was a murmur through the crowd, while one person called out, Proceed, which came through the device Evie held in her hand. She scanned the crowd, staring into the blank faces of those still in their suits, the strange gems glowing above their heads. Then she looked into the eyes of those not wearing the suits, finding many rapt with attention, while others refused to look at her. They probably wished to kill her now and move on with their day, but they weren't going to get that chance.
You have ignored my people, because you do not consider us advanced enough to exist with you. To you, we are little more than annoying insects, not worth your time or trouble. Even when we presented you with an existential threat, you deferred judgment, instead allowing one of your own to make the decision for you.
The Athru threat turned out to be nothing more than a misnomer, a short Sill near the front called out. It was not worth deliberating. A simple treaty solved the problem.
There was murmur of agreement through the audience. A simple treaty. Bullshit. They weren't getting off that easy.
Sill Sanctuary, I present this possibility to you. Not only are humans your equals, we have become your superiors.
There was an uproar from nearly every member of the sanctuary, most of them standing and jeering Evie, others saying nothing, while their faces contorted with fury. The speaker who had been standing at the podium when they arrived stood in front of Evie and raised both arms. A string of words slipped from his mouth, which the translator caught. Be silent, and allow the human to speak. She has given undeniable evidence. Evidence! He pointed to the ground where the guard still lay. After a few moments, the chatter calmed down, and most still retook their seats, though a few remained standing. The speaker moved away, and Evie continued.
You have seen how easily I dispatched with your people. My physical capabilities are far superior to your own. As a member of this new human race, I demand you immediately end your association with the Athru and assist us in driving them from Coalition space. She couldn't be sure, but she was greeted with what sounded like bouts of laughter from the group. It reminded her of Zenfor's laughter when they had been confronted with the interdimensional entity at the XL Nebula. A mocking sound intended to embarrass her. Someone else called out, You are just one human. How do we know your strength is nothing more than an aberration?
And physical strength is not the only attribute we consider when judging a species for its viability. Traditionally, humans have scored on the weak end of all characteristics.
She and Esturva had discussed this, and how she was to proceed in the face of this inevitability.
I am the first in a new breed of humanity. We are on the cusp of a genetic leap which will propel us into an advanced state of being. The fact I am standing here before you should be evidence enough. Not only is she stronger than we are, Zenfor added in her own language, she can withstand the vacuum of space as well, if not better, than I can. She is also faster, and her mental skills are significantly improved.
Why should we trust the word of a traitor? One called out.
Listen to me, Evie said, stepping forward. The only reason Zenfor and I are here today is because of this governing body's complacency. It is your unwillingness to act which allowed the Athru into this region of space. It is your lack of willpower which gave them license to destroy humanity, and thus it falls to you to rectify this mistake. Zenfor did what none of you could do. She made a choice that she and Melesse would assist us. Her word should have more weight, because she made a decision based on presented evidence, while you sat there and deliberated ad nauseum.
She illegally shared our technology with you humans.
Because Zenfor saw what none of you did, our potential. While you were sitting here in your comfortable chairs debating something thousands of light years away, Zenfor was witnessing firsthand humanity grow beyond its bounds. And you, she pointed at the audience, you allowed this species to come into this area of space and disrupt the balance because you were scared. For the first time, you'd encountered a species you weren't sure you could subjugate if they didn't leave you alone. So you took the easy way out. You didn't make that treaty because it was convenient, but because it was safe. You are cowards.
Most of the Sills stood, yelling what she could only assume were obscenities in their language, as she'd removed the translation device. She needed to be defiant against their rebuke, but standing there taking the verbal abuse wasn't easy. At any moment, any one of them could rush her. Evie glanced over to Zenfor, who nodded her approval. She brought the translation device back to her ear.
You know nothing of us, one of the Sill in the audience said. How dare you judge us?
I judge anyone I deem inferior, Evie replied. Had there been no threat, this body could have made an easy decision when my ship brought you the information 18 years ago. But you were deadlocked. You left it to Zenfor to decide for you. You allowed others to explore the threat while you sat back and watched, waiting to see what would happen. That is cowardly.
Evie made sure to look in as many sets of eyes as she could. She noticed some of the Sill who hadn't stood to argue, watching her intently. She turned her focus to them.
The humans you knew before were part of the old breed. They are dead. I am something new. Those who survive the Athru will become more than you can even imagine. And while you sit here doing nothing, humanity continues to change and grow. We are evolving to counter this threat. When is the last time you can say the same?
No one else spoke up, but Evie wasn't done yet.
The Sill have become stagnant. It is you who are obsolete and not worth our time. But unlike you, we do not write species off because they have not reached the evolutionary or technological level we have. We work with them to bring everyone to the same level. Because change is the key to thriving. Not static, but dynamic. If you remain as you are, you will only become more obsolete, and humanity will continue to surpass you in ways you can't even imagine. Are you willing to sit back and allow yourselves to become a footnote in history because you cling to this idea you've already reached your pinnacle? And because the alternative is too risky? Think of the potential of the Sill. If you changed, if you assisted us to drive them out, there is no telling what our two people could create together. But as long as the Athru infect this part of the galaxy,
It is a future that is out of your grasp.
She paused, looking around the room.
Finally, something the Sill cannot do.
There was another raucous yell from the crowd, except this time it wasn't all directed at Evie. Some of it was from the members in the crowd who'd remained silent, standing and shouting at those attempting to rebuke her. If nothing else, her message had gotten through to at least some of them. She stepped back, placing the translator on the podium, and snuck a glance at Zenfor, who actually smiled. Evie had done what she could. Now it was time to see if it would bear fruit. 35. Cass stared at the two faces on the screen in front of him, though the term faces was being generous. Instead, he stared at the masked visages of two people on the bridge of the Bortos, a light red gem above each of their heads, glowing and pulsing with their words as they spoke. He didn't know if the image of a Sill in their uniforms was meant to intimidate, but if it was doing a damn good job of it.
Why is an Athru aboard a human ship? Have you taken the ship for your own?
One of the Sill asked Esterva. As soon as they'd broadcasted her image and her voice to the Sill ships in pursuit, they'd stopped any offensive maneuvers, and instead fallen behind Tempest to follow, and nothing more.
I am aboard because I wish to be, Esterva said, and this ship is under my protection. You are not to fire on it, based on the terms of our treaty. The treaty does not permit it to come into Sill space, nor does it grant you the right to fire on Sill ships, said the other Sill. You are correct, of course, she said. It was a mistake on the part of my human crew, who misunderstood my orders. Rest assured, I will put the current captain to death and assume command of this ship at once to prevent any further mistakes.
Cass screwed up his face. He didn't like the sound of that. Esterva turned to Talia.
Ensign, take Rabot into custody and escort him to the death chamber. I will be along shortly to deal with him.
Talia looked from Esterva to Cass, unsure what to do. Then Cass caught Esterva's eye, and she winked at him, out of view of the Sill. He stepped forward. I apologize for my actions. He stood and walked over to the door, nodding to Talia. He was ready to be taken into custody. She came over to him with a puzzled look on her face.
Hold my hands behind me, but keep us here, he whispered.
Zenfor must have found a way to keep her and Evie's presence from those on the Bortos secret. Otherwise, they would know they'd been boarded. But they seemed oblivious.
As you can see, the problem has been resolved, Esterva said. Except you remain in our territory, one said. And you have still not explained why you have not eliminated all the humans on your ship. It is our understanding the Athru mean to exterminate all human life, the other added. This ship is different, Esterva said.
Cass wasn't sure where she was going with this, but as long as it gave Evie and Zenfor more time to accomplish their goal, he didn't care.
The humans aboard aren't like those remaining in what was once the Coalition. It is difficult to explain. But killing these humans would result in a substantial loss.
What do you mean? The taller of the two Sill asked.
These humans are in the process of evolving beyond normal human standards. They possess skills that eclipse those of my own people, and probably yours as well. Observe.
She nodded at Samaya, who stood, walked over to Esterva, and took her arm, wrenching it back. Esterva screamed and fell to her knees.
What the hell? Cass whispered.
I have no idea, Talia replied. It is a trick, one of the Sill said. Samaya let go of Esterva's arm, which was now clearly broken in two. It hung at an odd angle.
I can assure you, these humans are not like others you may have encountered.
Council? We are getting word from the sanctuary, the Sill on the right said. One of these advanced humans is addressing them right now, and she has disabled two of our soldiers, breaking their bones. How is that possible? The ship's council asked.
They made it, Cass thought. Way to go, Evie. You see, this batch of humans is different. Killing them is not in our interest. And I can assume you may now find them worth a second look as well.
Estrva flinched as if she were in pain. Stand by. The screen went back to a view of the stars flying by. Zal, cut that comm. I don't want them listening in, Cass said. Comms are out, Zal replied. Cass ran over to Estrva. Are you all right? She nodded, holding her arm.
I will be. I'm a fast healer.
How did you do that? Cass asked Samaya.
I didn't. I just pulled her arm back like she instructed me to on my control station.
Estrva revealed a small transmitter from under her robe. You have had a communication device on you this entire time, Cass said.
For self-defense only, she said. Or for cases like this. By moving my arm fast enough, I managed to break my own arm against the floor as Samaya pulled me down. It's painful, but not unbearable.
Cass couldn't believe this. We need to get you down to sickbay.
Not until we're done with them, she said. We got lucky Evelyn made it. But she still has to convince them. It will all be for nothing if she doesn't. I would think appearing before a bunch of Sil and taking out their own people should do it, Samaya said. Did you know she was going to do that?
Cass shook his head. He'd left that part up to Zenfor, considering she knew her own people better than he did. They're calling in again, Zal said. Cass ran back to the door beside Talia, while Estrva's face went from pain to neutral.
Activated,
Estrva said. The image of the two Sil reappeared on the screen. Your claims have been verified. The Sanctuary are debating the merits of your human's argument and are in the process of a medical review of the human. Conclusions are pending. There has not been a formal announcement, but expect a decision shortly. Until then, do not attempt to move your ship or leave our space. Once the Sanctuary has decided on a course of action, we will decide how to proceed. However, if what you say is true, and you really are inferior, expect a swift death. No, Cass said, stepping forward. This Athru isn't bound by the rules of the others. You have seen that for yourself. She does not believe in their doctrine. I ask she be spared. She can provide valuable knowledge about the weaknesses of the Athru, if necessary. The Sil looked at each other. If the evidence deems her valuable, it will be considered. They cut off the comm again. I guess that was a good thing? Hank asked. I don't know, Cass replied. But the important thing is Evie got her message across. Whatever they do now is up to them. Now all we have to do is make sure the Sil don't examine any of the rest of us. That may not be easy, Zal replied. They are dependent on evidence. They may insist upon it. We will figure something out, Estrva said, wincing again. Hank, take over. I'm going to take Estrva to sickbay, Cass said, draping her long arm over his shoulder, despite the fact she was half a meter taller than him. Do you want a security escort? He asked. No, I've got this, he replied. He walked her to the hypervator door while she held on. I can make it on my own, she said. But I want to thank you for that back there. You could have turned on me very easily. I don't think Evie would have ever forgiven me if I had, he said, ushering them into the hypervator. That's assuming she wants to see me again. Trust me, Cass said. She does. That was uncomfortable, Evie said, stepping out of the contraption Zenfor assured her wouldn't harm her. Instead, it had felt like she was being squeezed all over, like every part of her body was in a giant vice, and for a few terrifying moments, she thought it might never let go. Well? Zenfor asked. A Sil scientist stood off to the side, reading the various glyphs and runes that scrolled across the screen in front of him. Evie had left the translator back at the podium, so when the Sil spoke, it was in their native language. She couldn't tell from either the scientist or Zenfor's demeanor if the results were positive or not. As soon as the scientist finished speaking with Zenfor, he turned to her, giving her a last once-over, and then left them alone.
I assume that's a good thing?
Evie asked.
As good as we can hope for. He's confirmed you're not lying, and is presenting the results to the head of the sanctuary, who will then disseminate the data to the rest of them.
Then what happens?
We return to Tempest.
Both of us? Evie asked. She found it hard to imagine Zenfor not wanting to stay among her own people now that they were finally back.
Despite your protestations, they still see me as a traitor. That's not an easy thing to change. It will be better if I don't stay. I don't believe my future is here anymore.
She looked around, and even though they were in a small room without any windows, Evie detected a hint of wistfulness in Zenfor's eyes. The door the scientist left through slid away to reveal the speaker Evie had seen when they'd first addressed the sanctuary. He was tall, and his clothes were more ornate than those she'd seen at the audience, with purple and gold trim outlining the hems to create gorgeous patterns within.
"Human Evelyn Diazol," he said in a baritone voice, "your claims have been substantiated. I have submitted your results to the sanctuary, but based on what I have seen so far, I do not believe the treaty with the Athru will stand after this. You have demonstrated your superiority to them, though we did find some odd discrepancies in your genome."
"Yes, I've been told it is strange."
The Sill regarded her. "You present a compelling argument. Never has the sanctuary been so enthusiastic about their respective positions. As humanity has, as you say, caught up with us, we will be more inclined to assist you in your goals. After all, had it not been for the Athru invasion, perhaps all of your species would have attained this level of advancement in time. But we also must consider it was the Athru themselves that pushed you to become more by challenging you."
Evie glanced at Zenfor, who remained stone-faced. Did the Sill know she was part Athru? Or did they think Evie's genes were completely human? It was difficult to tell if they'd accomplished their goal or not, but she didn't want to ruin their potential victory by adding unnecessary information. Instead, she smiled at the Sill. "I suggest you return to your ship to await our decision. It may take some time."
"Thank you," Evie replied.
The Sill speaker turned to Zenfor.
"As for your crimes, you showed initiative beyond the scope of your position, thereby violating your dedication to the Sill cause. But as your actions have had a positive effect in bringing this new form of life to fruition, we will not sanction you for it."
He gestured at Evie when he said, "form of life."
"If you wish, you will be allowed to return to your home in Cantor. However, you can no longer act as consul for any Sill ship."
Zenfor gave a slight nod.
"Thank you, Speaker. However, I will return to Tempest with Ms. Diazol and renounce myself from Sill life. I do not wish to embarrass my family further, and there will be no more concern over the possibility of me further violating doctrine. No one wants me to remain here."
The speaker regarded her a moment.
"Had you not arrived with this human, you would have already been put to death. I don't make this offer lightly. If you decide to leave us again, you will never be allowed to return."
"That is as it should be,"
Zenfor said, though Evie detected a hint of regret in her voice.
"Very well. Your ship is currently in the Quavos sector, accompanied by the Bortos. You may use the space beneath to return as you arrived."
"You were made aware?" Zenfor asked.
"The Bortos herself informed her crew after they communicated with the Coalition ship, after you arrived. You are a talented consul, Zenfor. It is a shame you could not have fulfilled your duty to the Sill."
"I will regret it the rest of my life," she replied.
The speaker took one last look at them, then turned and left, leaving them alone in the examination room.
You okay? Evie asked. Fine, Zenfor replied. We should return.
She led Evie out of the room and back through the myriad of connecting halls until they emerged back into the long, curved hallway with the open roof they'd first arrived in. However, this time, Syl stood around the edges of the walls, watching Evie as she strolled past. Some craned their necks or moved others aside to see her. They are just curious to see the new human. Don't let it concern you. It was hard not to. All those eyes on her made her feel more like an exhibit than a person. She was grateful when they finally reached the portal again. Before they passed through, Zenfor removed the flashlight again and strapped it to her arm. Evie took one last look at the place with its towering stone walls and the purple haze of the southeastern sky as the Thyslaea star began to rise. She stepped through and was enveloped in darkness once more, the only light being Zenfor's flashlight pointing the way forward. Are you sure you're okay? Evie asked after a few minutes of walking in silence. They'd already passed both of the stone pillars in the middle of the intersections. I'll never understand the human preoccupation with my well-being, Zenfor replied, distaste in her voice. We just don't like to see those we care about in pain. And if they are in pain, we like to try and help. There's nothing you can do for me, she said. I can tell you you're not alone, that I know what it's like not to be able to return home again. I'll never be able to go back to Sisk. More than likely, it's been obliterated. But even if it hasn't, they'll never take me back. Perhaps, Zenfor grumbled. So then, is your misery supposed to lessen my own? No, she said. It's just meant to let you know you're not as alone as you probably feel. And even though I'm not captain anymore, I want to offer my appreciation for you staying with the ship on behalf of the crew. We wouldn't have made it nearly this far without you. You're welcome, Zenfor said, though she didn't turn around, nor did she speak again for the rest of the journey. After watching Box reset Esturva's arm with a fair amount of pressure, he'd cursed at how difficult it was to set the ultra-dense bone and treat it so it was like new. Cass had gotten a comm from Hank saying Evie and Zenfor were back on the Syl ship, and they had requested a shuttle to return them to Tempest. Unfortunately, Box had heard and immediately volunteered. Cass hadn't wanted to send him, but the truth was he was more resilient than any of the other pilots, and if the Syl decided to change their minds at the last minute, he was better equipped to still return with Evie and Zenfor than anyone else. But it hadn't been like that at all, and with Esturva by his side, Cass watched Box pilot the shuttle back into the bay, incredulous they'd pulled it off. The shuttle set down, and the side door slid open to reveal Evie. Cass walked up to meet her at the bottom of the short ramp. How was it? He asked. She shrugged. Like walking through the bowels of someone's intestine. You got that too, huh? He couldn't help but smirk, and before he knew it, she was hugging him around the neck. She pulled back after only a moment. What was that for? For helping me find a purpose again, she said. In this one rare instance, you were actually right. I'll take that. Zenfor walked out past the two of them, headed in the direction of the exit. Everything okay? Cass called to her. She didn't respond, but before he could press further, she was already gone. What is that about? What happened in there? It's not easy returning home after so long, Evie said. She turned to Esturva. I heard you helped save the ship. I'm afraid I may have only made things more difficult, she replied. Now all the Syl will expect everyone to display your abilities. We'll find a way to deal with it, Evie replied. But until they make a decision about entering the conflict, there isn't much we can do. I wanted to thank you for, she screwed up her face, for demonstrating you're not just interested in me, that you actually do care about all humans. Of course I do, she replied. I never would have fallen for your father otherwise. You know, Box said, as if appearing out of nowhere. Cass hadn't even seen him exit the ship. Interspecies sexual relations are my specialty. I would love to hear more about the process you used to create Evie here, especially the intimate details, so I might document them.
Absolutely not, Evie said. Go find some other guinea pig.
Why is it no one wants to help me with my research? God, Box yelled, throwing his hands up in the air and walking away. It's like there's some big secret to it all. I know how it works. You stick this thing inside that thing and go to town. You're all a bunch of prudes. He was yelling now, following Zenfor's path out of the bay. Prudes! His voice echoed through the cavernous space.
Why is the robot so obsessed with interspecies relationships? Esterva asked.
We think it's because he can't have them himself, Cass said. Don't worry, I'll talk to him. I'll just leave you to it. Evie smiled.
We'll be fine, I think. In time.
Cass took a look at Evie's face and could see where once there had been anger and resentment, now there was openness and acceptance. Even after everything, she was still willing to listen if there was yet more to be revealed from Esterva. Cass couldn't help but find it admirable. He nodded at them both and trotted off in the direction of Box, listening to his continued rants echo down the corridor. But as he passed the first junction, he caught sight of a large form at the end of it, standing with her back to him, but her arm on the wall. Cass broke off pursuit of Box and instead walked carefully down the corridor as not to startle Zenfor.
Zen?
He asked.
Leave me be, she replied.
I don't know what happened out there, but whatever it was, I want you to know I will make it worth it for you.
I have truly lost everything, she whispered.
No, he said, coming up right behind her. You still have us. You have this crew, this ship, and you can count on us to be there for you. And I promise you, if it's the last thing I ever do, I will find a way to wake up Sester. I will drive this ship into the heart of the Coalition itself to make sure we reach Claxia Prime and find a cure for him. That's my solemn promise. She turned to him, and he almost stumbled back. Her eyes were wet.
Your promise is no good if you're dead.
No, it isn't. But this crew doesn't leave people behind, no matter the circumstances. As long as this ship functions, we won't stop looking for a way to help him. I'm asking for your trust in me and this crew that we will keep our word. He stuck out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, but reluctantly took it in her own.
Then I'll hold you to it.
This has been Memory's Blade, Infinity's End, Book 8, by Eric Warren. Narrated by Larry Gorman. Copyright 2019 by Eric Warren. Production copyright 2020 by Eric Warren.